All right. Good evening, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to this Region 12 Board of Education special meeting, January 3rd, 2017. Thank you for attending. Rebecca, would you take attendance, please?
Anthony Amato. Here. Valerie Anderson. Alan Brown. Here. Gregory Cava. Rebecca Devine, I'm here. Michelle Gora. Here. James Hirschfield.
Here.
Stephanie Kolnick. Here. Jennifer Pody. Here. Lisa Rausch. Here. Michael Sinatra. Here. Peter Tagley. Here.
All right, we're all here. Thank you very much. All right, next we have an invited guest with us, was Mr. Douglas Gillette, our bond counsel. Mr. Gillette, if you would, I appreciate it, go up to the podium there. Doug, we've received your letter of December 13. Perhaps, knowing what some of the issues are, that you could make some introductory comments, and then if board members have questions, they could ask you. Is that fair enough?
Certainly, I'd be glad to. The bond resolution that was...
Can you please speak up? Thank you.
Let's see. The bond resolution that was acted upon by the regional board and was submitted to the voters. Okay. I'll try and get closer to the microphone. Okay, the bond resolution that was acted upon by the regional board and was submitted to the voters and approved gave some general description of the scope of the project as contemplated at the time and an estimate of possibly available state grants. The resolution specifically provided that the scope and particulars of the project could be reduced or modified by the Board of Education, or if they delegated that power to a building committee, by the building committee, and the entire appropriation as approved could be spent on the reduced or modified project. It also did not state a specific amount as a floor amount for the grants to be received by the project. There was a borrowing authorization for the full project cost appropriated and a provision that to the extent grants were actually received, the amount of the borrowing authorization would be reduced dollar for dollar. So, my understanding is that the district, working with DAS at the state, has made some changes to the original project plans. That does not require another vote on the project. We are still looking at a project that is the AgriSTEM Academy facilities, the science wing work, and that's within that provision that allows the board to reduce or modify the scope. A variation in the grants, as I mentioned before, again, wouldn't require a new referendum vote because the resolution contemplated that. So those were the two issues, main issues that were raised with me. There were a couple other questions that are addressed in the letter. Whether a referendum would be required if there was a change in cost, which if it's a reduction, no. If it's an expense in excess of the appropriated amount, yes. And if there was a submission to the voters to approve a change in the scope, if required, or an informational vote by district voters. If that change was defeated, would that impact the validity of the original referendum approval? No. The original referendum would stand.
All right. Does anyone have any questions for Mr. Gillette? Valerie?
Sorry. I've been on the board for many, many years. It seems to me you've been our bond counsel for a long, long time. How many times have you represented us? Or how
I-
long do you think?
Probably 30 years or more.
And about how many different bonds would you guesstimate that we've had put out to our voters in that time period?
I honestly don't have a good sense of that.
But several.
Yes.
I noticed that the wording in the language that you did develop the language for us.
Yes, with input
This
from the
referendum.
district, yes.
There are things like contemplated to include but not limited, and then approximately. For instance, if we decided not to present a particular part of the AgriSTEM program, just small animals or equine, that's in the purview of the board to do so.
Yes.
The only time anything is triggered for another referendum would be, as you say, an increase in the amount we need to borrow.
That would trigger it, or if there was I will give an example, which is, at the extremes, if the board were to try and spend the money that had been approved on a roof project, you couldn't do that without going back to the voters. But as long as it's staying within the general description of the project as set out in the bond resolution, the board has the power to reduce or modify and expend the appropriation on that project as altered.
And the fact that we're not necessarily building all the outbuildings originally contemplated, but moving some of the program under the existing roof to take advantage of excess capacity, that's not considered material.
No, that was one of the specific questions that was raised to me, and no, that is within the scope of the board to make that sort of modification. Because you are retaining the programs that were described in the bond resolution.
Great, thank you very much.
Alan?
I have a question about the last point, about the informational vote of district voters being held. And I realize that this is probably a little bit tangential to your position as bond counsel, but our board counsel, in response to a similar question, told us, and unfortunately I haven't had the chance to follow up with him, so I'm putting you on the spot, so you can say, I don't know, or that's not my field. But he answered that question saying that informational referenda were illegal for boards of ed. And we've had several of those since the precedent that he suggested of 6970. So I was confused, and I meant to follow up with him to find out how we could have had several informational referenda when he says they weren't allowed. And would you have any insight as to that? Because your answer seemed to flesh with mine, which would be that we could have a temperature taking without it interfering with the bond referendum.
I am not aware of any Connecticut precedent that is absolutely on point. There is some case law, I believe, in other jurisdictions that are based on the concept that municipal entities, including regional school districts here in Connecticut, are creations of the state and can only exercise the powers granted by the state in the manner in which the state has granted them. And that in the absence of statutory authority to have a informational referendum, there is a possibility that it could be enjoined as a unauthorized expenditure of district funds. Now, I don't know any Connecticut case law exactly on point, but I know there is some case law in other jurisdictions to that effect. And of course, those questions are very much a matter of state law. So I don't have an absolute answer for you, but your attorney did cite something that I am familiar with.
What he cited, was that Connecticut law or was that another?
I don't know. Whatever case law he cited, I
Oh.
don't know the specific.
Oh, you were not familiar. Gotcha.
Yeah, I'm
Okay,
not familiar
thanks.
with it.
Yes, Peter?
So basically, if you are not a proponent of this particular project, the only way this project could be halted is if the state decided not to send it to the state legislature, how would that affect the decision if board members then wanted to re-present the problem next year?
The process that goes forward at the state with the presentation to the General Assembly as part of the priority list
Right.
is part of the grant eligibility process and the grant award process. Technically, if this project got no grants at all from the state, it could still go forward. It becomes a decision, a policy decision of the board as to whether to go forward with the project if there's a large disparity in the ultimate cost to the district.
So even if the state didn't want to, assumed it didn't want to fund this project this year,
Right.
they may say you can bring it back next year, subsequent years. Basically, the board could it still go ahead with the project and
Yeah.
bill the taxpayers for the money that the state would have given it?
Yes.
So we could screw everybody who wasn't in favor of this, or any member of the public who would feel disdained by the fact that things have changed financially, fiscally, but you don't need to hear from us. We can just go ahead and pound this project right through, basically.
It's a policy decision for the Board of Education.
I don't mean that in a negative sense. I'm just saying, basically, on appearance sake, it looks like we're in charge of this project, whether the state funds it or not. And if we want to go ahead, even without state funding, we could go ahead.
That's correct.
Now, that's interesting.
Of course, I may say that nobody has intimated that that would occur, Peter. That the board would do such a thing. Doug, I wonder, I don't know how to ask this question. You have some familiarity, you just mentioned DAS, I assume with this client that you have here and other clients, you have dealt with the state on these types of issues over the years. Is that fair to say?
Yes, I'm not as deeply involved as your project engineers probably are, but I've clearly had discussions with the school facilities unit, the folks at DAS as part of the grant process.
Do you have a sense, and if you don't, that's fine, but do you have a sense, given the current climate, everything the state is dealing with now, knowing where this project is, that if the board were to hold an informational referendum, regardless of what the results were, certainly if the referendum was voted against, let's say, as an informational referendum, what impact that would have on the state as to whether to put this forward on a preferred list or anything like that? Do you have any sense of that?
Not as a legal matter, but as just kind of practical thought.
Yes.
The process involves screening of the projects. There's a limited amount of grant money available. If there's some indication that the municipalities and the voters making up the district don't want the project to go forward, I would hazard a guess that perhaps the legislature in the screening process might remove or reduce the grant.
All right, and that might not be the case if the referendum, the informational referendum, were successful, if there was still a majority of folks who wanted to go forward with it, without holding you to this.
Yeah, no, but I would think that a negative vote would probably be of more impact than a positive one because you've already had a positive vote.
All right, thank you. Anyone else? This is your opportunity. Oh, I'm sorry, Valerie.
I'm definitely not a lawyer, but I'm kind of curious about the way where we stand in terms of the juxtaposition of what appears to be a correct, lawful, and within the statutes of Connecticut, positive referendum result. Something like 70% of our electorate voted to do so, do this project, and accepted a higher dollar amount and project now that we've been able to right-side it by maybe $10 million, as far as I know right now. But I'd like your opinion. I'm treading carefully, but I ask this out of ignorance. Tortures tortious interference. What happens when there has been a lawfully passed referendum and some people, over time, as the project evolves and gets right-sided, start interfering with the state to stop it, to overturn the 70% approval? I mean, at what point can we just say the citizens have spoken?
Well, I think you can say it, the citizens have spoken. I don't know that there is a tort that arises from people going to their state government to express their feelings on the project. I'm not a tort lawyer, but my sense would be that, you know, you have the right to petition your government, the state government, and raise concerns. But I think the district's position is that this has been approved, and at this point goes forward until you know, the board makes a decision to the contrary.
Okay, thank you.
Anthony?
Doug, I just want to test my understanding of what you said earlier, or your response to Jim's questions. Another referendum would not trip any, there aren't any technical tripwires that would, by virtue of just going to referendum, regardless of the question posed, would throw us out of the process in Hartford. There are political ramifications, certainly, to the optics of going back to the people who need to make the next decision as it goes through the gates in Hartford. But there's no technical tripwire that would throw us out.
If it was an advisory referendum, then the results of an advisory referendum would not affect the bond referendum. The other situation that I talked about was if a modification to the original referendum was brought to the voters and that modification was defeated, the original referendum would stay in place. If a modification is brought to the voters and that modification is approved, well, then you've got a different project, and I think then it does become a question of whether you're still within the original grant application, which would be a discussion you need to have with DAS.
Okay. Thank you.
Anyone else? Anyone else? Mr. Gillette, thank you very much.
My pleasure.
Appreciate it. Safe drive home.
Thank you.
All right. All right, item 2, updated ag STEM. I'm sorry?
I'm talking to Sue. She has
Oh.
the handouts and for everybody. Right, this one and the other one. So let's, yeah, give it just for the board. I'll just do here the board this way. Sue, let's do them and we'll do. Here you go.
You got enough down there?
Let's see. You need more? Good?
Thanks.
You want me to start? Okay, good evening, everyone. We're here to just give a review on an update on the Ag STEM program and the revised financials. This is really for the board to ask questions and to help us fine-tune next Tuesday, so that this way we have what we need. The first thing you receive, some people have it in black and white, we don't have a color printer, but this is the revised design that went through many, many revisions after working with DAS. I didn't bring the original, but if you remember in the original, we had a building for the large and small animals, plus an equine center. We had 3 greenhouses. We currently now have 1 extra building where we have included the garage and the animals, the large animals. We've moved the greenhouse to the south. We are still working, fine-tuning this with Castle Booze and O&G and the state, but right now, this is where it is. As Val said, we constantly resize the program, but the main point that we had to address from DAS was the fact that they wanted us to use more of the footprint of our existing building. Okay, so that is just for your information. I'm going to start on page 1, and different people are going to do different pieces. So the EDO 49 is a report that goes to the state when you are doing a project. So the left was the original, and then we have the EDO 49R, which is the revised, and that's where we are right now. So basically, when we originally set the projects to the state, it was 73,500 square feet. We are now at 56,305 square feet. We have we had originally revised and put the 18,000 of new addition, but now we took away from that. So now we have 13,715 less square feet than we originally did. And the same thing happened with the change of the buildings, and we reduced that by 12,000. So basically, the big thing to understand right there is that we are now at 56,305 square feet. It was listed incorrectly on the priority list, so we do have to work on that. I did alert DAS to that, but that is the number that's correct at this point. The original project cost gross, when it was 73,500 square feet, was $36,513,960. We have reduced that by $6,556,552, which is a reduction of 17.96%. So now the agri-science program is $29,957,408. This happened after a 3-hour meeting at DAS with the state attorneys, our attorneys, members of the Board of Education, of the Building Committee, Mrs. Gallo, myself, Mr. Geeson, Mr. O'Leary, and basically they wanted the Ag STEM to be under $30 million. So that's where that happened. So the projected student enrollment, when we originally did this, it was 240 students. It was done a while ago, almost 2 years ago. The board voted maybe a month and a half ago to send 139 students to DAS in the new ed spec. So the EDO 49 now has 139 students, and that was listed on the priority list with the state. The project financing, in the original, it was 36 million. I'm not going to read all of that. The change was 6 million, so now we're at $29,957,408. The progress payments, the state grant at 80% is $23,965,928, which leads the local funding to $5,991,482, which we have rounded off to $6 million in the financial model, so that it can be a little cleaner. The tuition has been updated by the state, and the sending towns send $6,823 per student, and the state sends $2,861, and these numbers were checked with the state. So with that said, I'm going to go to page 2. At page 2, I will give you a little overview. Then I'll ask Michelle Gora and Anthony Amato to chime in. We've done a lot of work with the enrollment. There is a lot of discrepancies out in the universe about this, because you can go with wait list numbers, you can go with applications, you can do with enrollment, you could add some attrition, you can talk about recruitment. So there are a lot of different numbers. So Anthony Amato went and he looked at the numbers and was able to put together an enrollment scenario. So I'll ask Michelle and Anthony maybe to just walk us through this so that this way people understand.
Present your stuff, huh? So if you look at the chart here that you were given, if you're going from left to right, you can see sort of where we were, because we've been looking at these numbers, as Dr. Cosentino said, in several different ways over the months. So if you start on the left-hand column, you'll see the total 226, which was a number that we had looked at before using the 3-year averages. If you look at the next column, the previously approved position, the 139, that was the number that we had approved, I think it was November. Is that right? All right. What Anthony did was went back to all of the enrollment data for all of the sending towns and looked at applications, looked at the wait list, looked at actual enrollment, and you can read the captions underneath. He pretty much explains where all the students are coming from. What's difficult to see here in the shaded area, there's a dark line. It's consistent in all of them, so you can just write it in. There's a really dark line that you should be able to read a 4 in there. That number is the number of students, Region 12 students, currently in Region 14, right? That's a 4?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
And below that is the number 16. Those are the Region 12 students that we anticipate enrolling in the Ag STEM program once the program comes back here to Shepaug, and that is based on trends at Nanawag in Region 14. So that's the 16 and the 14. The numbers above are just different variations. So if you look at the first, that 78, it's total enrollment without the wait list. So that's the number of students from our sending areas currently enrolled in Region 14 without looking at the wait list. All right. If you look at the next one, you get a 3-year average of the total enrollment of the sending towns in Region 14 without the wait list. This one is including the cap, the Danbury cap, but no Bethel. And you can read that down below. The next column, the 122, adds the wait list back in. What's So I think that's worth talking about just a little bit, because when we first started this whole conversation, we were talking about applications as a gauge of interest. So when we were looking at enrolled numbers in Region 14, we were not capturing the students who had applied but been denied acceptance based on space limitation. The Region 14 was turning away students from every town because they could not take everyone that was applying, which was sort of the impetus for the whole project. So by putting the wait list back in, it is looking at students who applied and were accepted and ready to go. There is also, I guess at this point, we should just mention, there's been a lot of talk of attrition, which there's some disagreement about exactly what that is. If you look at the difference between the number of students enrolled and those who graduate, there is very little attrition. But if you look at the number of applications versus, and then the wait list, and then the graduation, there it's what we think is around 15%, is that correct? 14% of students who actually don't complete, but most of them actually never started. So for whatever reason, they were given admission or they were waitlisted. They never started. They never showed up. So there's that 14% there. So, and that was taken into account with these numbers, right? That's what I mean by the wait list. So these were students who were ready to come, but were denied a spot because of space. All right, so that's, so if you look at that next column, the 122, that is the corrected 3-year enrollment plus wait list with the Danbury cap and without Bethel. Then if you go to the next two columns, these two columns are the corrected 3-year average with the wait lists. I'm assuming the cap is in there too.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that wasn't listed, but the Danbury cap is in there. +1, this is +1 for all 4 years. And then the following two columns is +1 for every incoming 9th grade class. So that's a lot of different numbers there for everyone to consider. Well, and you'll see let's see. The last two columns. Well, you can see in the bottom the difference between the 127 and the 145, and then the 142 and the 163 is Bethel. Just yes or no. That's listed down below. If you are wondering which column represents the number that we agreed to go with back in November, it would be the column where the total is 142. It is a corrected 3-year average plus the wait list +1. So that is the column that is the most closely reflects the scenario that we agreed as a board we would go forward with as, those are the conditions. That's the +1 with the cap without Bethel. That was what we had agreed would be our model that we would build upon. But what Anthony has done is gone back and corrected the 3-year average and included that wait list so that it reflects 142 students versus the 139. So we actually went forward with a number that is 3 students less. And that's sort of a run through. If people have questions, it's a lot, but I'm asking for questions.
From the board.
From the board.
So what's your forage? What becomes your
You go.
Oh, I have a bunch, but I'm just going to start with what you just finished with. if the fourth column from the right is 127,
Yes.
wait list plus 1, 3-year plus, and then the next one is 1 plus 1 times 4. I can't figure. Oh, it's because each of the schools. I see. All right, so we've gone from 127 to 142 because of the number of schools each have 3 years that you're adding 1 to. Like 6 schools times 1 is like roughly 5 schools.
Danbury, the cap.
Danbury is capped, right?
You don't apply-
Okay.
in
So
any
that's where that
circumstance,
goes.
You don't apply anything to Danbury.
Oh yeah. This discrepancy between the CTDE is Connecticut Department of Education,
Yes.
like SBE, whatever they are. Do we have a? I mean, these are opinions. Which one counts? Do we know, Michelle?
So a question came up as to whether or not it should be +1 or +1 times 4. The state's attorney, who, by his own admission, and I spoke to him directly, is that, first of all, this was not his agreement. He didn't write it, so he didn't know what the author had intended. But in his read of this, he thought it was referring to total enrollment. So his interpretation is that it would be total enrollment +1. But he was very quick to come back and say, however, what really matters is what the two parties to the agreement thought the meaning was. So, in the agreement, or the parties to the agreement are descending towns, respectively, and Region 12. So if you have an agreement between the two parties as to whether it means A or B, that's, in the end, all that really matters, and his opinion is worth just that, his opinion. So if you look at one of the sending town agreements, there was a footnote written at the bottom, I think it was New Fairfield, that referred to the 3-year average. So the increment was against the 3-year average. So I think it's fair to say, at least New Fairfield, it's a 1 times 4 understanding for New Fairfield.
Which is good. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Danbury, of course, their interpretation was, and they used the words explicitly, total enrollment, because there was a question when we first got the cap, was it per year, or was it total enrollment? But they cleared that up with their language. So the other 4 sending towns, it really, it's a matter of speaking directly to each one of those sending towns and asking them the question is, what did you think that those words meant? It's as simple as that.
Okay.
And if
So, yeah, so I guess we have a week to do that, I guess, if we're going to.
So in theory, I mean, there's a range in between those two endpoints, Alan. I mean, those are two absolutes, right? So
Right.
depending upon the answers to those questions, you could come up with another number that's not even on here, but it's not going to be,
It could vary because
gonna be in between.
one town could say one thing and another town could say another
Sure.
thing. And, all right, but at best, maybe they'll all say,
Yeah.
the higher number. Yeah. Okay.
so,
And
I mean, that's,
so we just have to find out if it's a matter of both sides agreeing. Then we just have to find out what they interpreted it as.
correct.
Because it would behoove Region 12 for it to be the 1 times 4 as opposed to the opposite. And then my other question is, I don't understand what you're talking about with attrition. The attrition is between acceptance and enrollment, not between enrollment and matriculation.
Yeah. Yes,
Okay.
both.
Both.
Yeah.
Wait, there's.
It's, yeah, we're not quite sure if I think we understand classically attrition would be those starting in 9th grade to graduation.
Right.
But there's also a decline or a drop from acceptances to enrollment. So if you look at the data supplied by Region 14, right, and again, balanced against the same questions asked of the sending towns through some of the FOIA requests that were put out there, all that data points to the same data set. And it shows that you go from applications, you drop, I think it's 47%. As you go from applications to acceptances, there's a 48% loss. When you go from acceptances to graduation, because they didn't give us the data with enough granularity to understand the midpoint, as Michelle was trying to say, is how many do we lose from acceptance to enrollment would be the natural next step, and then you would look at ninth grade to graduation and look at those discrete numbers. Well, we didn't have that. All we can go from is the two data points, which was accepted to essentially graduation. So the whole drop across there is 14%. You can get it all, for argument's sake, you can get 13 of that 14% going from acceptance to enrollment, and then only seeing a 1% attrition rate to graduation.
Right.
We don't,
Which would be,
which is what we think.
Yeah.
So I think Kim looked at some of the numbers to see what the graduation rate was, but for sure, there is a drop of 14% from those 2 points.
but how is it, I mean, you would think that with, because that was my next question about the waiting list, when you add that waiting list in, if you have attrition between acceptance and enrollment, wouldn't that be made up for by a waiting list, which is right there? That's what the waiting list is for, right? So in other words, if you accept 50 people and only 86% decide to enroll, then there must be 14% available seats that could then immediately be filled by waiting list, or does it not work that way?
It doesn't appear to work that way.
Maybe,
And I think
'cause
it's because the conversations we had with Region 14 was the wait list was a function of capacity.
Say that again?
The wait list was a function of capacity. So when they accepted, right? Now, why didn't they go back if they saw a drop and go back and pull off the wait list? I don't know.
But from what you can tell, they didn't do that.
No, because if you look at the data, it's applications is equal to acceptances plus the wait list. There's no other category. So they went either in this bucket or that bucket. And if there was such an adjustment, that math wouldn't work, right? So they could have filled that with students from other sending towns, but we don't know that from the data we've been provided.
But you are seeing somehow, though, I'm just kind of confused, because if you're not seeing any more than 1% attrition from enrollment to graduation, it must be happening before enrollment.
Yes,
We just can't peg where it's happening.
right.
Do we have to take this into account, or
I did.
you did? And that's in the one with the big arrows on it.
Yeah, so when you take the wait list statistically as a group of accepted students, right? These are otherwise accepted, capacity constraint students. They're going to behave just like the other tranche of students in terms of how many people are going to decide to stay with the program, how many people are going to be able to graduate with the program. So, you know, it just seemed logical to take the total wait list and reduce it by 14%, and that becomes your net wait list, and that's what's represented in the
That's
numbers.
okay.
Yeah. The only thing that's in here that is debatable is the quality of the wait list itself. Are 100% of the students truly accepted? Were they vetted were they otherwise vetted? Again, the questions asked, the answer given was yes. So, you know, the wait list wasn't discounted any further for, you know, for I don't know, unqualified students who somehow got on the wait list.
Well, maybe not unqualified, but I mean, was it like lottery?
that's not the right
They didn't. In
word.
other words, they didn't answer discreetly whether it was a lottery system or whether it was first come first serve. But the implication is that, as opposed to prioritized a little lower for whatever reasons.
You know, if it's like the college acceptance process that some of us are familiar with, you know, when you get a number of accepted students that equal the empty seats, you stop reading applications, because at that point, unless you're building up a wait list,
Well,
a
they do.
qualified
They do, yeah.
wait list. I have no insight into
All right.
any of that, and I'm not going to pretend like I do. But if Kim, you were in that district, if you could comment, this would be a good time.
acceptance to Region 14 is a self-limiting process. Students are in 8th grade, they decide that they have an interest, and they go and they see their guidance counselor. The guidance counselor's job is to counsel that student as to the opportunities that are available to him or her. Do they have a demonstrated interest in an agri-science pursuit? Do they have a good attendance record, discipline record? Do they have good grades? All of these things are taken, and we did not stop when we got enough kids at Nanawag. The whole list was ranked. It was a blind study of every application. I would be reading them as the assistant or the interim principal, and I would rank. I would give a score to each of those areas. The next person, the director of guidance, say, would also do the same thing, not knowing who the student was. That would also go to another administrator, the director of the program. This, in addition to the letters of recommendation that students had to obtain from their teachers, and the interview that they had with Mr. Davenport, makes the wait list a very self-limiting proposition. If you're going to go through that whole process, chances are you are an appropriate student for this program. I would never say that occasionally a student with pie in the sky expectations doesn't listen to their counselor, applies anyway. If I said that never happened, I would be lying, and I try not to do that. But for the most part, this is a very difficult process. You have to ask for a lot of things along the way that are difficult to ask for. And so, yes, it becomes a self-limiting process, and the wait list is a good and strong pool of candidates.
All set?
Yeah, so in other words, they're qualified, they're just ranked slightly lower than the first acceptance.
That's right. That's right. Great kid, good grades, says they like horses, but never really had anything to do with agri-science. There's a low score on the demonstrated interest level, for an example.
Thank you, Kim. Greg, did you have a question? No, I don't. My question was answered. All right. Anyone else have any questions on what's been presented so far? Michael? Thank you, Kim.
You're welcome.
I'll start with what I hope is a simple question. If I'm correct, again, to look at page 1, the number that we sent to DAS for the projected student enrollment was 139, correct?
Yep.
So if we go to page 2 and the analysis that you were doing, at this point, are you comfortable with that number? Are you thinking that number is too low, too high, or are you most comfortable with giving us a range?
Who are you asking?
Who are you asking?
Both of you? Either of you? You can.
Go ahead, you
I'll
first.
go first. I would say, based on the vote of the board in November, I would go with, the column that at the moment, has a 142 at the top. I would leave the 139. It's 3 students. We're just building a model. It's close enough. Mm-hmm. But that was the philosophy that we agreed on of the 3-year average plus 1 with the Danbury cap without Bethel. Obviously, if we found out tomorrow that we had Bethel and that was going to, that would put us then over in the 163, then we might want to consider it. I don't know how important that number is to the state as long as we have capacity. At this point, I think what's most important for our region is the business model that we're looking at and how many students we're anticipating. As long as we can serve those additional students, which I think we have capacity even in our revised building, I don't know how important it is to update that to the state, if we move that number up. It would probably be important to them if we, for some reason, felt compelled to go with something lower. But I'm comfortable with just leaving it with 139 because with everything being all corrected, it comes out to 142, and I think that's close. You might disagree.
Yeah, just a little bit.
Anthony doesn't think so.
Yeah. Well, I would answer it this way, Mike. One, I'm more comfortable with a range. given, the type of analysis that we've got to do. Especially when we look at the business case that's going to result from this, there are a number of things that have been talked about at some point or another. Like, should enrollment be purely a function of demographics? Well, if you look back and you try to look at enrollment as a function of demographics to test that theory, I haven't done it myself. I was only able to look 2 years backwards, and I saw no rhyme or reason with regard to demographics. But 2 years is not a sort of data point. It's a data point in my mind. If you really want to look there, I'd start with looking 10 years backwards before you take something like that and then start looking 10 years forward to say it's going to be a causal. But I think, intuitively, at some point when demographics get really tight in a given town, I think it does start to change people's behaviors and thought processes. But where do you put that pin in that map? That 15 years out? Is it this big? I mean, look at our own district. We're shrinking the most out of all these towns, and we've yet to deny any student the opportunity to go to a VOAG program because of costs or something like that. So if you look at us as an example, we're sort of immune to demographics. But that doesn't mean New Fairfield, to pick on them, would behave differently. We still can't figure out why Danbury did what they did, and they're growing. And they've been in the paper saying they've got capacity problems. So there's a lot of things in here that, to that point, Danbury cap in. Can we get the Danbury cap relaxed a little bit, maybe from 15 to 20? Who knows? We've made an assumption that that's not going to move for the next 25 years. Right. We could easily say that, well, maybe 5 years from now, when a new administration's in town, when something that caused them to cap it changes, will that go up? It could go down, too. So there's a lot of variables that there is no earthly way, I think, that we can put all of those and try to forecast against them with any level of precision. There's just so much known data that we have, which is the enrollment data and the cost side. So, yeah, I would like to see a range, and then looking at the things that are the pluses and minuses, and then people can put that all that on sort of in their own basket, mix it up and decide where they're going to come down. Because, you know what I'm saying? So where would I put the center point? I'd probably put it right now, unless I hear, I would agree with Michelle, it would keep the center point at the 139, but I'd like to hear from those other 4 sending towns on their definition of where they think, if it's 1 times 4 or plus 1. But assuming they like New Fairfield, agree to that, then I think the 139 is a fair play, as long as we understand that there's puts and takes around that. And I think there's a legitimate question of the wait list and the quality of the wait list, and but I think that's a marginal reduction, Mike. I wouldn't say you cut the wait list in half, not listening to what see Kim is shaking her head. But if you want to take, I don't know, 5% further off the wait list, but that still puts us in a range, so you could say, okay there, but I think something else is going to happen there, which kind of brings us back to dead center. So it's a long way of answering your question, but I think we've been around this bush for over a year now, right? And we've heard a lot of different opinions. We've gotten a lot of data. I've looked at a lot of data, and I'm exhausted with trying to figure out what combination of things might or might not happen. There's no science to this.
We appreciate that. I think the entire board understands that this is not a simple question to ask and to answer, because otherwise we probably would have done that a long time ago. Yeah. Can I follow up on the cap? Because that's something that the board has been talking about a lot, something that concerns the board as well as probably the general public at this point. And we can't project future, but we can go back to history. So I want to ask you about Region 14 and how, if ever, a cap has influenced Region 14. So let me give you a scenario. Has has the Ag STEM program at Region 14 ever said to New Fairfield, we have 8 students that we'd like to take in that are superbly qualified for our Ag STEM program, and has the town of New Fairfield said to Region 14, I'm sorry, we're only going to let you send 4 students. We're not going to let 8 come. So has that happened? Has that ever happened as far as Region 14 is concerned?
Are you saying Region 14 rejecting
No, Region 14 being told that the sending towns
Oh, by sending towns.
sending towns will not send certain students. That they're,
I-
this is our 3-year average. Sorry, we're not going to let more students go to the ag program.
I have no knowledge of that.
Nor do I. Okay. That's an interesting point, because I think we've been concerned about that at some point Danbury or other towns will say to us, we have 20 students that are interested, but we're only going to let you take 10.
Well, so they have, any sending town, as we learned with Danbury, it's been a learning experience, is they have the right to institute a cap, effectively, right? In fact, the way, so the law says, it was 1064 or 65, says that sending towns, first of all, can choose, right, which program they want to do business with. That's why we needed the agreements to begin with, right? That the sending towns, in the absence of a written agreement, have to, I don't want to say obligated, but I guess that's probably the best word, is they have this thing we've all talked about, the 3-year average. It's a rolling average, and they're required to send no more than their 3-year rolling average in the next subsequent year. So your question is, has somebody exercised their rights under 1065 to say, I've hit my 3-year average and I'm stopping here? I have no knowledge of that. Danbury took the other route and said, I could write a written agreement, therefore I'm going to put this cap in. It makes it, which obviously makes that cap very legal for them to do. They could rescind it too. So in 1065, we could, as Region 12, for example, look at our 3-year roll, and we could institute effectively a cap by looking at the 3-year rolling average and saying no more. And I think in the course of time, we were presented with some case law that where a town, I think in Milford or something, tested this, and it was upheld by the courts to say that they're only obligated to send their 3-year average, and after that, if they have no obligation to send another student. So, this is one of those things that you have to put in that basket, Michael. It says, in the future, will somebody read that and decide, oh, I think I'm going to go there? I don't know.
Hence, again, we've been saying all along that these numbers are very conservative, and this is one reason why it's conservative, is that in the past, no one has really exercised that right, but that doesn't mean that they couldn't in the future.
Yeah, so the +1, Michelle just pointed out, so the +1 is an increase to the 3-year roll, but because the state wanted to see a willingness on the part of the sending towns to exceed their 3-year roll. But obviously you can't mandate a sending town to send more kids, because that would mean that they could have to force somebody to go to an Ag STEM program who never wanted to go to an Ag STEM program, and obviously you can't do that.
Nor would we want to.
Right, so that language, when I had this conversation with the state's attorney, was the language can't be that forceful to say you shall do this, because you can't.
Ask another question. This one has to do with geography. As you know, the numbers and the analysis that you were doing was based again on Region 14's numbers enrolled in their program. But obviously, we are geographically closer to the western edge of their previous catchment area. So there are sending towns like Danbury that are closer to Region 12 than they are to Region 14. I'm wondering if in any of the conversations that you've had with the state or looking at this, whether geography does affect total numbers of enrollment? In other words, could we expect more Danbury students simply based on the fact that we are closer geographically to Danbury, or whether that's not really a factor in enrollment?
I mean, I could quickly say that I thought the last time we talked about proximity as being a factor. To what extent it is a factor? Well, I'm going to play it safe on this one and say it's more of a binary. Is it a factor, yes or no? I think it is at that point. Michelle's going to finish the rest of that question.
So to quantify it is always
Oh,
the...
Oh, no,
I figured you had
we
a-
can't, no, we can't quantify. I was just
Right.
going to remind everyone that we pointed that out in the beginning, that we are closer. You keep mentioning Danbury, but New Milford
Yes.
shares, is much closer. So we could expect that would increase interest. We don't know how much, and we don't have data to support that. So that's just one of those areas where we said, with proper recruitment, a brand new program, the latest equipment, emphasis on STEM, the proximity to the new campus, those are all interest generators. And how much interest, we shall see.
But again, that interest is hard to quantify, and B, not in this projection that you're showing
No,
us.
this is the 3-year average plus 1, which is in the agreement. That's sort of where, at sort of a minimal, that's where we felt, we've got historical data, 3-year averages. That's sort of a given. The plus 1 is our conservative attempt at interest. Given all of those things that I just mentioned about, the new program, the new building, the proximity, all of that, we feel is enough to generate plus 1.
Last question, I promise. When we began this journey and started looking at Region 14, Bill Davenport, I remember told the board that his recruitment efforts were minimal and possibly really
Almost non-existent.
almost non-existent in certain towns because they were at capacity in Region 14, and they felt, why recruit more when we'd just be turning people away? It just doesn't make sense. And I understand his perspective on that. So these numbers also are not assuming that we're doing anything beyond what Region 14 did, which was, as far as I was to understand, just going to area middle schools, presenting what Region 14 offered as far as an Ag STEM program, having students sign up, but nothing beyond that, correct?
Actually, he didn't even do that in all of the sending towns, some of the ones that were farther from him and closer to us, because he was at capacity. So I believe he didn't actually visit all of the middle schools because there was no need. He was turning students away. So I would say there was almost no recruitment. I mean, there might have been a flyer stuck up in guidance, but not a visit, not a info session or anything like that. Not necessarily in all of the schools because he visited a lot of them, but visited, from what I understand, our sending towns less because they were farther from him. Yeah, that's it.
Thank you.
Sure.
Kim, did you want to add something?
Only about every 3 seconds, but I'll be good. If you want to look at a current number that talks about the possibility of the wait list or the cap changing in Danbury, you can look at the number right now that's sitting in Nonawag. That's 19 students from Danbury. Their number went up a significant amount this year. They did not turn any of the students down. However, I agree with using the cap in our conservative estimate. So please don't get me wrong. I do think that the 82 number at the bottom it should not be a part of the area, and that is because that represents the students that are sitting in the seats right now, and we know that half of them were turned down. We know that the capacity is not there. So it's really not fair to use the 82 number as the bottom. That assumes that not only are we not going to recruit, there's not going to be any further interest, but half of the kids that are applying now are not going to do it. They're just going to stop. They're going to drop off the map in 2018. And I don't think that's a fair assumption. So I'd like to make that point. I think it's a fine average when you go from 122 to 163, but I think you should throw out the 82, and I think you should throw out the 226, because we were reaching, and the economy is different, and we shouldn't make assumptions that things will explode right off the bat. But I think that the 122 to 163 is a fair estimation based on real numbers.
Okay.
I have a question.
Mhm.
While you're up there.
I'm happy to do that.
Where are we with Bethel at the moment?
We gave a presentation in December to Bethel. They were extremely receptive, asked very good questions, had obviously prepared themselves for the meeting. And when I spoke with, I sent an email to the assistant superintendent. She got back to me right away and said they have not considered it as of yet. It's not something that is pressing for them. After all, this is not opening for a couple of years, and we have a vote coming up in June. But they are certainly considering our program, and she will let me know when that happens.
Okay. Lisa, did you have a question?
I did.
Is this for Kim or just?
No, I'm sorry. This
Thank
was
you, Kim.
for Michelle and
You
Anthony.
can stand there if you want.
We may need you. Thank you so much for doing this. I know that this has been a lot of work to put together, and I know I'm new on the board, but I'm optimistic that we're beating yourself up to get to 39 that we voted on. But I'm optimistic that with a new facility, a new building, a new program, that I think we're going to be surprised with the numbers. And I feel like we're being very dismal with trying to get to this number. And we're just doing this on analysis on Nanawag in the past 3 years. But I really do think, after looking at these numbers in the other towns, that I think we're going to be very optimistic and happy with the numbers that we end up with. But I wanted to thank you for working on this.
All right, thank you. I'm sure that's appreciated. Valerie?
I've been on the periphery of this how many students conversation and tried to work, I think, inadequately as an ombudsman between this kind of presentation and some citizens that have had some honest, wonderful questions. And I do honor that kind of disagreement that has been ongoing the last couple of months, because we've all learned and we've all had to go back and sharpen pencils, and that's very important. But I think it's extraordinary, the amount of work that Anthony and Michelle and others, and certainly Pat and Bob, have done to patiently go through this extremely complicated effort. Whether the methodology is wait list, percentage of wait list, percentage of applications, percentage of actual enrollment, elements of attrition or gain. I mean, there's so many moving parts that when I just tried to explain it to people, I just had to sit down. And so the fact is, they've been living this, and I thank you very much.
All right, anyone else? Alan?
Excuse me. When Kim was talking about wait lists, it made me think the wait list that you've added here, we were talking about, that's 40 people,
Correct.
40 kids. And the 40 kids, you've already removed this,
Attrition.
but I can't even, I'm trying to think of a good average, this ephemeral attrition that we can't quite put our fingers on.
We'll come up with a better, we promised Kim we'd come up with a
All right.
a
So-
variance of,
Variance, this variable. So is that 40, is the wait list, is that everybody? Because that should only be wait list from our sending towns, though, right?
that's just the wait list from our sending towns.
Okay, gotcha.
Okay, and since you brought that up, Sherman is a sending town in this analysis, right? Right. They're not part of the kids who are here as part of our high school. Otherwise, we'd be double counting, you know, because if you have 30 Sherman kids in this building who all decide tomorrow that they want to now be Ag STEM students, guess what? They're on a different schedule, right? They're now grant eligible. They owe us $6,800 instead of what, you know, the tuition that they're, so, you know, we just got to be mindful that, you know, we can't double dip, if you will, so.
All right, anyone else? Michael?
I'm just wondering if the number of students that we could serve here at Shepaug for the Ag STEM program, max capacity, that number has also changed with the reduction of square footage.
No, I don't know. Pat, Greg, anybody?
At this point, I don't think so, but also remember that every year you can apply for grants. So in the future, if we maybe want to add more greenhouses or add another building for large animals, we can always do that in the future. But I think we can honestly at least come very close to serving 180 to 200 students. Don't you agree, Mrs. Gallo?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the plans that we currently have for the 56,305 square feet could serve 200 students, but not more than 200 students.
I would say total. I'm not saying an additional 200 students. I'm just saying I believe we can get close to
Total.
180 to 200 students. We'd have to add probably more staff, okay? And the operating costs would increase and all of those things, but we definitely can accommodate more students.
So then if we're going back to history again, and I know this is for Region 14, this is really going back in history, well before, I'm sure Ms. Gallo was there. I'm wondering if you did see a dramatic spike when you opened the Ag STEM program in students, and then a gradual decline, if it's continually been a gradual increase in total numbers of students enrolled until you reached that magic number that you felt was your capacity in Region 14.
That's a board decision in terms of increasing the student population size, and they, just like you're doing, talk about, when they talk about increases, they talk about what impact it's going to have on the building, on staff, on dollars, and so forth. So those are our board decisions. However, in the years 2009-10 up until the present, what we have seen when we looked at October 1st enrollment, the actual students that are in the seats, is that although population in these regions have been in decline, the enrollment has gone up, especially in the last 3 years since we started talking about this new program. Now,
I'm sorry. The enrollment where has gone up?
At Region 14, in the program itself.
Okay.
In the program itself. I can't say to you with a definitive term that the last 3 years the enrollment has increased because of our program. So I'm not going to say that, but it's kind of a coincidence. And the enrollment has been declining and the numbers have gone up.
Did Region 14 do what Dr. Cosentino had suggested we could do? In other words, did they ever expand their Ag STEM program, build additional square footage, for example?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. They're doing it now.
Yes, they did.
They're doing it now, and they've done it over the years. Just before I came there as an administrator, they had done, I think 5 years before, they'd done an addition. Bob, you were the business manager then. Why am I saying?
We actually expanded the whole program.
That's right.
So that's been done at least once.
Oh, yeah. More than once. More than once. They're currently adding on to things in that building. I don't know exactly what they are, so I don't want to misspeak, but that's very typical.
Greg?
Yeah, Mike, I just wanted to clarify one thing about Dr. Cosentino's answer to you about the capacity of the building. And that is that although the building has capacity for those larger amounts, there's no percentage move in reducing it to make it smaller. You don't save anything because at some point in time, all you're removing is the middle of a room. You know, you're not reducing the number of rooms. Therefore, all you're doing is making them smaller. And since they're fitting into an existing building, you can't really take anything out. What are you going to do? Leave a corner of the building unoccupied? So, as a matter of fact, it doesn't really cost any significant amount more. These are minor amounts to have a facility that's capable of expansion, so that you're not forced to build later. So there actually is no, even though there's surplus capacity, it doesn't result in any significant surplus cost. This is what our engineers and architects have told us, because of that factor, that all you're doing is pulling out the middle of a room, which means it's a concrete footing and a roof. And you're not eliminating any of the peripheral stuff that cost all the money. So that's that explanation. So although we do have excess capacity, we've not overbuilt.
Peter.
I just have a minor observation, Mr. Chairman. I noticed when Anthony made his presentation to the public on the tuitions and the money from sending towns, I remember the figure was $10,000, if I remember correctly, per student. And I see where we have 6,800 and change from the towns, but the state, I guess, has gone from 3,200 to 2,800 and change. Could you explain, please, what happened? Could that figure go to nothing? I mean, what makes that figure steadfast, if any?
Bob, can you answer that?
Yeah, Peter, that's a function of the state government and what they did in the formulation of the budget. They actually had more students enrolled in ag than they had before, but they capped the dollars that they were putting into the grant, so it diminished when you do the division, it lowered the per student state contribution to all the programs across the whole state. So when it was 32, and with the economic climate and so forth, this is the most current number they have.
So the state at liberty.
State can
Turn
go
that
back the
number.
other way. It can come down. I mean, it's a function of the state contribution to it and the number of students
So
as the divisor.
you're always at risk that the taxpayers will have to underwrite the differential between what the sending schools send and what the state would send.
It's possible.
That's all.
And they could
Just-
get a windfall. I don't, it's.
I understand.
But this is the most current number.
Okay.
All right, anyone else on the population? Yes, Greg.
But Bob, that number has gone up and down in the past.
Absolutely.
It's gone higher than it is now. It's gone lower than it is now. It's not a fixed number. It changes from year to year, and it's a formula.
Right.
Or not necessarily every year, but every few years it changes.
When they make that change, this is the end result of it. And that's why we use that most current number in this projection. We didn't go backwards
Okay.
and take the optimistic 3,200 that we had when it was 3,200.
Well, and I believe we had this discussion when we submitted it to referendum, that this was a number that goes up and down. So this is nothing new.
Right.
Anyone else? All right, turning to page 3 then on our handout. Dr. Costina, did you want to introduce this?
Yes.
Oh, I'm sorry.
So just a quick procedural question on the agenda. We've already accepted 139. We've already voted on the plan in November and the ed specs. Is there anything that the board needs to vote on to accept tonight?
No, I don't.
Okay. So the 139 stands for our ed specs as well? And what we've already approved stands?
Well, that's what's on the priority list with the state.
Okay.
So I think we have to go with it.
Sure.
The ed specs, and you're going to find now, the 139 is really an important data point for the board, because it is going to be one of the 3 scenarios that Bob Geeson is going to review with you on the financial program for the agri-science program. So we met last week, myself, Kim, Bob, Michelle, and Anthony, and for 4 hours to go through operating costs, staffing plans, revenue, all of these things to try to really get a handle on the financials. And Bob worked very, very hard to work on the bonding and the debt and all of those things. So he has three numbers. We're going to first present 139 students, that's page 3. Then we're going to present 122 students, that's page 4. And then he's going to present 163 students, and that's page 5. Okay, so everyone should have that in front of them.
Yes, Anthony.
Before we leave the enrollment, especially before we do the forum on January 10th, I think the only sort of unanswered question we have here, obviously Bethel in or out, but based on what we're hearing, it doesn't sound like Bethel's going to be making a decision by next week, right? So we understand that Bethel is upside. But the issue of the 1 + 4 or the +1 × 4 issue, I'd really like to see that closed off with the remaining sending towns before we hit the 10th, because then it doesn't change the endpoints that Bob just did, but it does influence where you think that center mark is, Michael, to the question you were asking before, right? So we're going on right now, again, with the assumption that the 139, but that assumed the +1 × 4. If we get confirmation from the sending towns, then I would say, yes, Valerie, there's no need to revisit that. But I don't think we need a motion or anything to change that. It's just a request to go back and close that loop. Or
Okay,
you
I'm
saying I
speaking for
need,
Dr. Costantino, although I haven't spoken to her. I don't know that we're going to be able to get that information from all these towns by Tuesday, but if you have anything else to add, you can.
I think
simple phone.
I have some reservations about doing that right now because it is just a very difficult time for people, and I don't know if I'm going to be able to reach everyone. And I don't know, I have an understanding, a clear understanding, that it is the 3-year average +1. I would prefer that the board maybe ask our attorney to give a legal opinion. First, look at the statute, maybe talk again to the state before I do that. I know that this is uppermost in our minds, but in the superintendent's minds, this is not going to happen until 2019. We just got hit with ECS cuts. There's a lot going on, and I just don't know if the board asks me to do that. I will try to do that. I don't think that's the way to go right now because we are working in that range. I think if you read the statute, which Mrs. Gallo and I did today, it supports our understanding. And so, but, I'll work and do whatever the board would like me to do.
Michael?
Just want to confirm, too, the analysis that you did here, Mr. Geeson, of the 3 scenarios, 122, 139, and 163, that to some extent this is an artificial construct. In other words, the numbers probably over the next few years are going to vary and hopefully trend upward. And so as those numbers creep up, that changes everything for the next 20 years, really. In other words, and we can't really do that mathematically. I don't know if we could really calculate if the first year was 122, if the second year was 125. You see the trend. It makes it difficult, if not impossible, I would assume, to really look at the end result, which is how much is this going to cost the region, or what kind of a net profit would the region make off of these increasing numbers. Am I correct in that?
We don't, yes, I mean, to an extent.
To an extent, you're correct. There is a fixed cost that's always in this, the fixed cost being your debt. Once you borrow it, you own it. As far as the other moving pieces, they've been accounted for in these 3 different scenarios. So where we needed to change things, your operational costs for heat, light, power, those kind of things, those will stay fairly steady because you're not expanding or contracting the building.
Right.
What you would see is some change in supplies, for example, which is normal. If you have more students, you're going to need more money for supplies. But that's a small piece of this whole thing. The break point for staffing purposes is when you start to exceed 35 to 37, I believe is the range, where you have to start looking hard at your staffing levels. But that's been accounted for in this models. In other words, we ramped it starting with the first year with no students, we needed one person. Then we have years where we start with grades 9 and 10, and then we add 11. Those are 3 staff members. When we get fully operational with all 4 grades, you're now at the point where you need 4 to run the program. When you start getting beyond where we are with the 163, you're going to start looking at making decisions of the staffing that was talked about earlier.
All right. If Anthony, I will speak to you after the meeting about the issue that you raised about trying to close the gap on the +1. I don't think we need to decide that for it. I'll talk to the superintendent about it, and we can wrap up on that. Bob, can you start with this?
Sure, I can. What we did in this, we started from the standpoint of what we just discussed with the enrollment numbers, and we built 3 scenarios with it. The first one is the 139, which correlates both to what the board approved and what's standing with the program at the state. The net result of this is on the page 3. And as you can see, looking across the first 2 years, we have a planning year. There's really no cost involved because we didn't borrow anything at this point. When you get to construction, which are 2 years, there's $125,000 reflected in the debt column. Those are for bands, short-term 1-year notes. By the time you hit the opening of school, we should be in a position to know our costs and go to the market and borrow. And what we did was we modeled this based on a $6 million bond to get this thing going. So looking across, you have your revenue for the whole period of time. You then have your operating costs, which are your teachers, your heat, light, power, and your supplies. That's $18,600,000. It nets you a total net positive number of $6,410,000. The debt over that time is $8,297,000. It leaves you short $1,886,000. So you're paying out more debt than you're getting in the net at that point in time. You have what we put in here was to recognize the anticipated local donation to be applied against that piece of it. It's $1 million. And so the net of after donations, excuse me, cold, is a little short of $900,000. On an annual basis, it's about $42,000 a year. So that's how this schedule works itself through. Excuse me.
Just a quick question about how you, if you could walk us through how you did the revenue, because obviously
The
there are
revenue
different rates of tuition.
Sure. The revenue was predicated on getting from each of the sending towns the $6,823 for the sending students. And then, the total students were bringing in $2,861 for every single student, including the ones belonging to us. We wouldn't be obviously paying ourselves the $6,008. It has 20 resident students in it, and the balance of the 139 or 119 students carry the 6,823 plus the state portion. All the models are done the same way. The students count locally is 20.
I'm sorry, Anthony.
Bob, sorry if you said this before and I missed, but all these models include inflation, right?
Yes, they do.
Okay. And they pick up, because we are just, obviously, we don't want to disclose specifics here, but we're negotiating a teacher's contract, so these cost numbers pick up where that new contract
That's correct.
leaves off, effectively. right?
Absolutely.
So when we ran the original cost model to what we've got now, what are we looking at, roughly like a 30% cost reduction? Operating cost reduction? Did you calculate that?
I didn't calculate that. I was strictly looking at going forward from where we are.
Okay, and
I really didn't
looked
look
at the
backward.
staffing numbers.
We
right,
did.
Based on the low enrollment.
Right. Staffing was a function of Michelle working in concert with Kim and with Pat, and they looked at the staffing model for both the academic side and what they would need for the agri-science piece of it. So this is the agri-science numbers that we're looking at.
So it's got, if I recall,
Only,
4
it's
FTEs?
what's in there is one in the first year for the, I call it during the first pre-opening. Then you go to 3, 3, and all the other years are 4.
Okay. And Michelle, I guess I'll ask you the questions. Then we tested it against the increase in students on the core high school, right? And if we needed additional teachers there, that would have come through in the analysis, right?
Correct.
So if I do the math, that means we need 0 core teachers because we have the capacity within the building, right?
That's correct.
Okay. Bob, the grant, the donation that we still have available to us,
Right.
the impact of this is somewhat understated, right? Because if we have the ability to we could basically offset the amount of the bond. So it's really $1 million plus the interest.
It is, but
Right,
I
so
took
it's-
a conservative approach, and we'll
I
talk
know.
about,
Just wanna-
we'll talk about that because there's a debt schedule in here that reflects that.
Okay.
All right, Bob, you want to?
And what, sorry, I lost my place in my notes. The state share, can you talk about that? And is that whatever amount you used, what was it, 80%?
It's 80%, and it's predicated off of the state priority list that they have us. We originally had a lesser amount in there.
And why was that?
That was on our earlier models. And we had petitioned the state to bring us to what's called a space standards waiver, because this building project by itself has some unique features to it that, for example, the equine center, the garage, those things aren't normal. A greenhouse isn't normal. We asked them to take into consideration that those spaces be removed, and what they did, evidently, is they took us seriously, and they granted us the full amount of the grant because it's right in the right in the legislation right now going into the state. They saw that we wrote to them twice on it, pointing these things out, because that's what it's just part of the process.
And the amount of the grant, because at some point, I think the state was revisiting their whole grant criteria, schedules, amounts, et cetera. That's still not settled business in Hartford? Greg, do you know? I thought we heard that Hartford was looking at the amount of project grants, their state shares, and they're reevaluating if 80 should be 80 or 79. Is that?
They haven't done it for this. Remember, there were 2 pieces. Number one, they weren't going to get less than you got on the list for last year. So when we were on the priority list, they were not going to get
Right.
Let me repeat that. If you remember that the bill that was passed that bumped us a year indicated that those on the priority list, which we were one, would not get less than the state share they were getting last time. Bob cited factors which actually caused them to increase the state share to the full 80%. I don't know what they're considering for the future, but I have not seen anything that leads me to believe that they've actually reduced it or have an immediate plan for what that number is. I mean, they may do it in the future, who knows? But the point is, that's why we want to get in this year underneath it with the 80%, which is what they've put on the priority list that's gone to the legislature, is 80%. Actually, I think it was technically 79.9999%, call it 80, but it was 80%.
So what point does that amount get locked in? When they vote on it?
When
it
they
becomes
vote on
law?
the bonding, yeah. When they vote on the bonding in toward the end of the session, May, June.
Thank you.
Bob, you want to continue? Thank you.
Sure. So that works us through the 139 scenario. The next one, which is page 4, takes a more pessimistic look and brings us down to the 122 number that we were talking about on the schedule. The schedule's done the same way. The student count, to answer your question about the revenue, obviously goes down in the same way because you have fewer students in there. You have 20 of ours and 102 sending into us, so your revenue number will decrease. It's actually lower by $3,720,000 approximately than before. Conversely, our operating costs, because we have fewer students, goes down by another $229,000. So the net of these two things, we end up losing approximately from the 139, $3,490,000. So it increases the loss to $5,375,000 after you pay your debt off. Taking the million again from that leaves you $4,375,000. And that averages out to little less than $200,000 a year.
Where did the reduction in operating costs come from?
The lower student count
Yeah, but is it function?
yields lower supplies.
Teachers are still at 4?
Still are 4.
So everything else is,
Everything else, but the student, they actually by lowering this over the 20 years,
Okay.
it's $229,000 less supply cost, if you will. The heat, light, and power stayed the same because we didn't do anything with it.
Right.
The staff stayed the same. We didn't change it. We didn't lower it for any reason. We left it the same way we had it,
right.
and that's the end result. So you took, it's about $10,000 to $12,000 a year lower supply cost.
And that figure came from,
That's based on our model and what we gleaned for what a typical ag program would cost you per student. And was originally in our original model. We didn't factor come up with and do a whole new analysis for anything. Rather, we kept that average as it was.
that came from Region 14, if I recall?
Region 14 and other districts. I don't know how many other were factored in there. I'm not privy to all of the other ag programs.
No, but it's an educated
right.
estimate.
Exactly. It's it's costing them.
Okay.
So that's the 122 number. Then we took the last piece, which was the 163 students. Okay. The 163 was explained, brings in the, yes, with Bethel now. And when you do this, again, the revenue goes up. In this case, because we're going from 139 to 163, it goes up to by $4,400,000. Our operating costs actually go up because we have more students. The reverse of when we dropped it. So we end up at this point picking up $4,118,000 over the 139 model, yields you a surplus over the debt of $2,232,000. You have $1 million of the anticipated local donation. So the net after donation is $3,200,000 to the positive side if you attain the 163 students, including the Bethel.
So again, same question, staffing stays constant
Stayed
at 4?
at 4, right, all the way through, because looking at it, we didn't catch a tip point. I went back and we were still able to satisfy the student count with the 4 staff members.
So kind of follow up where Michael was going before. Are we at a point that if we go beyond this number, Michelle, we should be adding another teacher? Are we close?
Close, well,
When you start, yeah, when you get
the
much,
ratio is 35 to 1.
So somewhere on the other side of this number, we'd have to start thinking about
Yeah.
another,
Oh, yeah.
another
Yeah.
teacher.
most
go-
definitely.
Yeah.
Michael?
Yeah.
But just continuing that thought, at some point, let's say when we get to 170, I don't know what that magic number is, we'll see a drop-off in revenue because of the additional expenses that we'll incur with hiring staff. But as that number continues to increase, that revenue again would continue to go up.
Right.
I would, I think, going back to where we started the conversation, that would be characterized as nice problems to have, right? And it'll all be interesting, and it'll be a nice problem to have. But I would kind of stop at 163. I mean,
It was a logical stopping point.
yeah.
Michelle?
Yeah, to just add on to this nice problem to have, we, as the accepting school, could decide at what point to accept students and not. We could have our own tipping point. So, for example, if accepting 2 more students required hiring a teacher, we could choose not to. And if we had 35 applications in a bundle, and that's the number that we need in order to pay for that extra teacher, then we could make that choice. But we would have that choice, and it would be, like they said, a lovely problem to have. But at no point would we have to take more students than what we've already got capacity in our teaching staff for, right? So.
So that gets you the 3 models that we worked through, and kind of works you through
So
the
where's our
larger
breakdown?
numbers of how this would work itself through.
Somewhere between.
So Bob, so the 3 models you've got here cover, this is just the ag program,
Correct.
right? The labs, because when we went, last time we went to referendum, right, we had all of the costs, including the labs, that we were,
And
when we talked
will-
about break
right.
even, we talked about essentially the ag program paying for itself and paying for our labs, right?
We have a schedule number 6 in this scenario, which picks that piece up.
Okay?
Okay? Basically, this is your debt load, all right? And we are working off some old debt that we currently have on the books. This just is a profile of the debt at this point. And the cost that we're contemplating for the AGS program itself is, including interest, $8,047,500. That's that third schedule or third column in. That's a 20-year note, 20-year bond. We look across this, we slotted in the cost of the science lab reno, okay, and that is going to end up costing us, after state grant, $2,651,000 with interest, $2 million principal. Our total debt profile at that point is the 5th column over before you start looking at these block numbers. So what we tried to do is to incorporate the science lab, the ag lab, balancing it against our existing debt load, and tried to level this as best we could, which is the first blocked in numbers. And if you work yourself down, there's 2 years where it goes up by about $50,000. All the rest of the bracketed numbers are coming down. Our debt numbers in the overall debt of the district actually declines over time. The next block schedule with the $50,000 going down is where that $1 million comes in. Obviously, the $1 million is actually slightly more than that if we don't borrow that money by the 3.25%. Conservatively, I just took the $1 million and ran it against the whole 20 and said the $1 million is going to offset the debt as well. Now that increases the debt load to further decline, and it's running about $63,000 a year, falling as we go through this whole project. So the debt profile for the district doesn't change.
Alan?
Yeah, about okay, so you just don't have the your first blocked column shows what's actually happening in the total debt column to the left of it.
That's correct.
The other debt columns, one is in a kind of an addition of the donation amount, and then the final debt column shows what happens after that, but we don't have a total debt column that goes down by that amount. You're just kind of indicating.
Well, we took that $1 million and applied it against debt to reduce the debt in every single year by $50,000.
Okay. This is your total agri-science STEM debt is $8,047,500.
Correct.
But that doesn't match up with any of the debts you have on any of your example pages, which is $8,297,500. Now I realize that's off by exactly 250, which means you've got 2 years.
The 250, Alan, is the 2 years where you have the $125,000 each year in a band. It's not a debt. It's not a loan. It's a construction loan of $125,000 a year.
Okay, so in other words, what you've done is you have.
I picked it up in there.
You
squared column, but not underneath the actual true.
I see. That's the 370.
There's where your difference is.
Okay, so they're over there. One of them is in your column.
They're called bands.
I'm trying to figure this out. It starts at 395. You got two. Then you have one extra then. If you compare let's go just to page 3. You've got two 125,000s there. And then, and one of those you're saying is construction debt.
It's 125 at the top of
that
column. Right.
Right. But then on your page 6, you have three 125s.
Right. We haven't borrowed that. That's in our budget today. I'm using the budget profile for just debt because we haven't authorized the borrowing of any money this year. When we formulated our budget for the 16-17 year, which we're working in today, we included $125,000 in there.
Okay, so basically you're actually including more in 6 rather than less. You have a little bit less in.
A little bit, but
okay,
it's still in a debt profile.
So my next question then is if all of this presumes that you're borrowing $6 million,
right?
And I think Anthony mentioned something along these lines, but I'm not being quite the money man that he is. I'll be more basic about it. Why don't you borrow $5 million as opposed to calculating in your $1 million 1 year at a time at $50,000? Because that would substantially reduce your bond debt.
It would.
But
I'm taking a conservative approach at this point.
But isn't it more conservative just to?
Well,
it
would yield you a lower number, of course. But we are looking at this $1 million in anticipation of moving the project forward. Whether we put it to the debt borrowing at that point. How this is going to get used is a decision the board's going to have to make in concert with the donation.
Right, but if it saves us a lot of money in our business plan, we should probably make that decision pretty fast, because we would.
Well, we clearly, even the borrowing is just the best look at it today until we get our final numbers. We may not even need the $6 million if the construction costs become less. It'll become less. I didn't want to bury a number.
Oh, no, I'm just
I
saying
wanted
that.
to be upfront and show that number straight up, and where you bring it into it, whether you lower your initial borrowing or use it 50 at a time, it's going to be a board decision at that point.
Right. But what I'm saying is that we're looking at what I'm trying to do through all of this is to try to settle on something which is, best worst case scenario. Because we're actually, what we're trying to do now in our decisions, both on the board and with the community, is to do some risk assessment. Because as Anthony said, there are good problems to have, and you worry about the least. You worry about the most that something's going to cost you, because if it turns out well and it costs you less, then that's great. Nobody worries about all that extra money they're going to have, unless they're worried about going to a higher tax bracket.
Right.
We don't have that problem as a regional school.
Well,
district.
what I was trying also to attempt to do is to, as closely as I could, get that $6 million to reflect the difference between the state and what we have to pay locally.
Right.
Moving it to a $5 million number and eliminating the $1 million column isn't a big fix for me. I would just have them rerun a new schedule.
Right, and that's what I thought.
And move it over. I just,
that
for our
upfront
purposes of discussion tonight, I just wanted to reflect these two things
right
properly.
But
if you want to move the $1 million over and say we
just
have
see what
it,
it looks like.
we could
Just see
do
what it
that.
looks like, because what I'm seeing is that we have 163,
Sure,
and 139 and 122, and I feel that we need to focus on 122 because, as I said, it's the worst. It's the worst possibility, and if we feel we can afford the worst, then everything else is great. 163 is with Bethel that we have no guarantee of, and I think the actual answer is somewhere between 122 and 139, which is why I feel
139.
somewhere in there, because I think we need to find out from those schools. We need a definite answer, and I'm not sure. Maybe we can talk about this as to having Pat call these schools and find out, because I think the more you know, the better. And as I've said all along, I think it just comes down to, how much we are comfortable paying a year for this. And it would be nice to know what really is the maximum, because anything that decreases from that would be great. So that's why, be as conservative as possible, but as realistic as possible. And that's why I'm thinking at this moment it's somewhere between 122 and 139. I mean, obviously we have no idea how to predict how that'll change year by year. But if we can figure out exactly where it is, at least in our prognosis, and then lop as much off as possible from that $1 million, then we'll have a number that then we can talk about, we can assess by adding the cost of the labs to it, and then we can have a discussion next week with the community based on an agreed set of solid numbers, as opposed to anything that is like, wow, we have a disagreement over this or that. That's just
Jen?
my 2 cents.
That's fine. All right, so numbers are not my thing, so I'm just gonna, full disclosure. But I'm just looking at, if I look at the scenario for 139, and we take that number and divide it by 20 years, we're looking at a loss of $44,336 a year. Oh, right, it was 20, if we're taking over 20 years. Right.
It's 23.
Okay, so I'm just, again, guesstimation, okay. So 44,000 and change a year loss. Average. So, because I'm not familiar with this, so would it be considered sort of the same scenario that the percentage of each town, the way we do now, right, would percentage of Washington would take that, and percentage of Roxbury and Bridgewater. So, and I think we were just sort of guesstimating that it's about 45% that Washington pays and roughly, I know everyone likes hardcore numbers, 20% for Roxbury and about, Bridgewater, and 35 for Roxbury. So then we're breaking that down at if a loss for 139, so then we're breaking it down for guesstimating-ish, that Washington would pay about 19, almost 20,000 out of that, and then that Roxbury would pay 15,000-ish, and then Bridgewater would pay 8,800-ish. I'm just breaking it down into numbers that somehow just seem a little.
And if we borrowed less to begin with, it would be slightly less than that number.
Okay, thank you.
We would have less interest costs at 5 million versus 6.
Michelle?
I just wanted to point out something, which, there's a lot of information for everyone to think about, but there's kind of two different things going on here. One is the operating of the ag stem against itself, and those are the three schedules of the 122, the 139, and the 163 that Bob presented, where we come out ahead, we come out a little behind, we come out close, those are those scenarios. But then if you look at the bonding schedule, that actually reflects what this feels like to our operating budget, which is different. And this actually does not include any of the operating. This is just pure debt payment. And since we have such a large bond coming off, this is falling in place with that. It's actually, if we were to just build it and not collect any revenue, it would feel like less than what we're paying now. So it's important to understand that as you're weighing that against the operating risk, the $44,000 of operating risk potential at 139 students. If you look at that versus the fact that if we built this and didn't collect anything, it would still feel like less because we have such a large bond coming off. So to think of it in terms of, yes, does the program pay for itself? Does it pay for the bond to build it? But also, what does that do? What is happening with our operating budget? Because that is that's our tax. Those are our taxes. Is this going to feel like more or less? And in the scheme of things, because we have these large bonds falling off, it's not going to feel like more, regardless of where you throw those student numbers. So everyone has to make that personal choice about, as we're talking about that risk and the belief of how many students we will or will not get. But thinking of that whole operating and student risk scenario in the context of the bond falling off and what that's going to feel like, I think makes it even less scary. Yeah.
Thank you. Valerie?
2 points. When we talk about Alan was talking about the use of the $1 million, I think we have to be very quiet and very mindful of the fact that that is up to the donors, that indeed it's for the program. It could indeed come off the top of what our debt might look like. It could cover expenses. It could buy animals and supplies that would take our operating expenses down or our capital expenditures down. But I think we have to be very careful, and I know what Bob was trying to do was to kind of have a tip of the hat that's there, and it could be very beneficial, but there's nothing that we can actually say about it right now. And obviously it'd be great if we had to borrow less, but that might not be the intent of those donors, so we have to respect that. So then going back to the debt service, the overall debt services was just pointed out, our comfort level is something like $400,000 to $500,000 a year for debt service, has been, with a few interruptions, will be because of the debt we're taking on when you do ag and lab. But we have to remember that when we do the ag and the lab, we will not have to necessarily dedicate a lot of our 1% fund to this building, say for 5 years, hopefully. I wouldn't go beyond that. We all need repairs. Maybe I'm being optimistic. So give or take, knowing our comfort level in the past has been somewhere between 500, 600,000 of debt service total yearly in the budget. The fact is we could possibly take some of that 1% and offset those yearly increases so that our operating budget will not take quite the hit. I think we always have to be mindful of the fact that the program isn't going to pay for the debt necessarily, unless we're incredibly lucky. So taking that low side, I forgot, Alan, what your phrase was about the best of a big risk. Let's forget about the million, because that's the proper thing to do. And let's just remember that we also have another back pocket of money in the operating budget anyway for that 1% that we could hopefully siphon off on a temporary basis, but to help offset some of the big, perhaps, jump in debt service for the first few years. And we have to remember this is a startup, total startup business. We have some really good, solid information, but it's going to be a leap of faith. But I think it's based on really good numbers.
Greg?
Yeah, I was going to say that we did not give very much credit for a lot of the positives in the analysis. I mean, we didn't give much credit, much significant credit for the fact that we could do a bang-up recruiting job and bring in more kids. We didn't give much credit for the fact that we're closer in a newer building. So while we didn't give those positives, there's another potential positive, which is, don't forget, the construction costs include several $1 million of contingencies, both based on price of goods and based on environmental conditions. If half of those contingencies are not realized, and you figure that if half the contingencies aren't realized, the state saves 80% of it, and we save 20% of it. Even with that calculation, it still could amount to 15,000, 20,000 or more a year in savings. So in other words, it helps offset some of the costs that may be there otherwise. But again, you can't count on that. But it's another positive that we're not giving any credit for in the model. And I think it's important to remember that we have loaded it with negatives. And Alan, you said a minute ago, well, we'll come in somewhere between 122 and 139. No, the range is 122 and 163. So we make, and already, I don't even know why we're doing a 139 model for any presentation, because already our model's at 142. So I'm not quite sure. 139 may be what we presented to the state, but that doesn't bind us in terms of looking at our business plan. That would be silly. If the number's 142, run a 142 set of numbers, and I think you'll get something closer to the midpoint, because actually the midpoint between 122 and 163 is about 142. So 142 and a half. So you're looking at something close to the midpoint of where you are there. And if we fall somewhere in the middle, that's probably where we're more likely be. But with good results or lower costs, we could get closer to the numbers that look like somewhere between 142 and 163. And if you did land in that zone, I mean, I think somewhere around, if you end up splitting the difference, end up somewhere around 150, you're looking at probably well over $1 million in surplus profits over 23 years or 20 years, whatever the model is. And so I think that there are a lot of reasons to believe that we should at least take that into consideration in the fact that we have given almost no positive upside to any of this. So that's just a thought.
Anthony?
But you have given positive upside in that the things that you haven't done. I mean, if you look at the wait list and you take it at face value at 100% less the attrition, then you haven't discounted at all for any of the other dynamics that might be in there. You know, you haven't taken into account whether or not so the towns can exercise the cap via 1065 in the future. But we didn't take that into account because it's offsetting with there are other counterbalancing positives. So I think the model, when you look at these numbers, we have taken into account the pluses and the minuses. It's like we only choose to focus on the pluses because it's the happy path. And we got ourselves in the referendum, we stuck to the happy path and didn't talk about the possible range of things that could happen. And we we found out that there were a number of firsts that never happened. The state never, Art O'Neill couldn't answer the question, what happens when they don't have enough money and call the list? I don't know. Never happened before. It was just a formality. And here we are, a year later, and the 3,200's not supposed to go down. It just went down. So I hate to sound like a wet blanket, but I wanted this time to be, let's be cautiously optimistic here about where we are, but let's be realistic and not go down a path that just talks about what's going on. Like, we're never going to get to 163 unless we have Bethel. Bethel isn't inclined to give us an answer anytime soon. Now, is it still out there? Sure. Should we say if Bethel comes in, they're going to pull, according to this analysis, they'll pull 20-something students if Bethel comes in. So there's a lot of upside just wrapped up in Bethel. So I wouldn't, that's why the range is there. Everybody's free to come down on whatever side of the range they think based on how they process all this information. But it's how we talk to the public in terms of where we put our collective confidence and where we think it actually will happen. Remember, so I'll hearken back to the referendum and ask that when we talk to the public, I think it's important that we said last time we came to you as a group, we positioned AgSTEM as a solution. Economically, it was going to break even, and by definition, that was, at the time, covered the cost of the labs. And now we're going to go back, and we're going to show them a couple of different things, but we can't kind of forget what we got to go back and sort of keep ourselves honest to that conversation to say, well, the good news is we've lowered the cost. The good, and we've done all the right things to kind of bring us back in here. But if we look at a scenario, we could say, for example, 163, just taking these numbers at face value. If we believe 163 is there, that kind of puts you back to where we were with the referendum. It covers the cost of the ag program, and it covers your bond. Thank you very much. And we're sort of back to even, if you will. If you don't believe the 163, I think Michelle and I were doing some fun math here. I think you'd get back to like 141 is the number that absolutely covers, or in that zone, covers the cost of the ag program, which is good, but I think it's important to say, but it doesn't cover the cost of the labs. Something we said the program was going to, which has now changed. So I just like to make sure that when we go, we kind of make that comparison back to the last data point, official data point that the folks have.
Michael.
To that point, I'd like to spend a little bit more time on the unhappy path, the most unhappy path we can talk about, which is the 122 that we have in front of us. Bob, so if you could just check our math again on page 4. That $4,375,964, if you divide it up, does it come out to 218,000 roughly of a loss per year?
I haven't done more than, I have 21 years, it's about $200,000 is what I came to.
200,000, approximate. Now, could you come up with a number for us in terms of lab costs per year then, that we should add to that number?
The lab costs are on your debt service, okay? And if you looked on page, it's spelled out by itself
Page 6.
on page 6.
And so that is, it looks like depending on the year, it ranges anywhere between 100 and 6,000 I'm seeing as a low to,
It's
160.
2,651,000 divided by the 21 years ago.
which is what? So 2,651,625 divided by 21 is
126,238.
okay. So if we add 218, or excuse me, 200, so that's approximately 326,238 total for the science labs and ag STEM per year under the 122.
Greg?
Yeah, the only thing we have to remember is that we're building those science labs anyway. You can't not build those science labs and still have a high school. And they would cost us more than the 2,600,000. You'd be somewhere up in the 3 million somewhere. I'm not quite sure. I have to go look at the numbers again. Because again, remember that the cost of the science labs has been pushed down by the fact that we are staged and mobilized with the Ag STEM project, which we wouldn't be if we just built the science lab. So they would definitely cost more. So to some extent, those numbers offset a little bit. You have to take that into consideration. So the worst case, when you look at the science lab numbers, although it might not pick up the cost of the science labs, you're still building the science labs. You have to do it. There's no question about it. So,
Michelle?
Just a quick question. At some point in all of the iterations of this, the state's reimbursement rate towards the reimbursement towards 2 of the labs possibly is higher because they'll be. I feel like we were getting a higher reimbursement on part of the labs.
No, we're still building 4 science labs that are not Ag STEM, and for which we're receiving a reimbursement a little higher than I think we originally anticipated. It's about 32 point something percent. It's almost 33% reimbursement on those 4 science labs that we have to build anyway for the building and are not Ag STEM related. But there are some Ag STEM science labs we're getting full 80% reimbursement on.
Okay, thank you.
Anthony?
Valerie, question to you, actually. Oh dear. Come on, get ready.
If I start now, it'll come on.
The donation.
Yes, sir.
Since you're familiar with it. If we take it off of operating costs, the way Bob has treated it is it's the conservative, it's almost a conservative treatment because it's not including potential interest savings if we were to net it off the bond, right?
Mm-hmm.
But you said something before about, the donor may say animals, use it to buy animals, which I don't believe is in the operating costs. So I'd hate to present it in a way and then come to find out that we can't use it because the bond cost right now is so low that $1 million is a material percentage of it. Can we reach out to them and ask and maybe get a little bit more guidance so we could feel comfortable putting 100% of it in at least the operating cost?
I'd really be very, very reluctant to do it because I don't think they've come to any decision. I think it's a bit sensitive. I think they support us completely. We all know that. Mm-hmm. But in our conversations, there was a wide range of ways this could be used in Ag STEM. And I doubt if just, paying off bond would be one of them.
Well,
it's certainly contributing to a decrease in the expense of supplying the Ag STEM in terms of just outfitting the equine center, things like that. But I just would feel very reluctant at this stage. We're going down a good path. I think we've done a lot of good work to refine numbers so that our voters feel more comfortable. I think we just have to look at as we say in New York City, a mitzvah, and let it go as a general mitzvah without application for now.
Okay, so as a fellow New Yorker, I actually know what you're talking about. But, all right, so and just to be clear, it isn't as sort of callous as we're going to use your money to pay off our debt, on a monthly basis. We would, for example, they would donate the greenhouse or that lab and this lab, which would be, in effect, equal their $1 million gift, right? Just to be clear. But the real question is when we present the numbers and we net off $1 million, I'm starting to get a little less comfortable that we can make that representation and then talk about it and its effects on things like concepts of break even and impact to annual budgets and things like that. What do you think?
Why are you less comfortable? The people have committed to $1 million, and if Bob has applied it
But I'm just hearing that we don't know how we can use it, and there are some things that don't fall into the bond or operating costs, like animals, for example. Those, the cost, tell me if I'm wrong, Bob, but if we need to buy animals, and it's $1 million worth of animals, that's not in the operating budget.
Isn't in the overall project,
Yeah,
Greg?
I don't have the language in front of me. They made a gift, I think, to be used, well, I shouldn't say, but I mean, there is language that was presented to us. I don't have it in front of me. But I would assume that they would want it used in the way that
Maybe I
would help the region the most.
misunderstood your point, Valerie.
No, my point is that they are being very general in their donation as long as it goes to this. How it's going to be used is unknown. We have to, I do think it's important to account for it in here as a notation. I'm not quite sure if I would go so far as to take it into page 6. I think it should just be accounted for or noted. But I don't know if the 50,000 a year, that's assuming that it's used to pay down debt or on a yearly basis or indeed on a total basis. So a notation is important because everyone needs to know how wonderful this donation is, and it will be an important asset to the project. But we don't know.
Alan?
But I would take it off page 6,
Well,
frankly.
well, that's the thing is the more we think about it, is it
No, I'm glad you did it. 'Cause
what
we have to
what's-
talk about it.
What's in number 6 is actually less glamorous and less grateful than, the $1 million coming off 50,000 a year is actually a little more pedestrian than perhaps one recognizes a $1 million donation as being. What I'm suggesting is actually the opposite. Is that before bonds are made to pay for the project, $1 million is already taken from the donation and put towards, and I think Anthony just said something along these lines, and put towards the equine center or the greenhouse or $1 million of something that the Diebold name could go on, as opposed to absorbing it this way. So not only would having to bond $1 million less, I think, be more advantageous to us because of less interest, but also whatever that $1 million paid for before the loan was taken is a concrete thing we can put a name on.
Absolutely.
And I think that's why I don't think we have to be careful. I think we could think about that as being
Because we get
attractive to
very
everyone.
close to that time period,
Right.
then things will gel, which is why I think Greg's attempt at optimism was very
Oh well, yeah.
noble.
About the optimism, I
because
realized
there is that
yeah.
in our pocket somewhere. It's just that we can't.
I've
throw
been
it in
thinking
yet.
about. I've been thinking about what I said before, and I was misspeaking. 122 is not our bottom. I fully personally believe that 127 is, and that Anthony already suggested New Fairfield had a caveat on theirs, which makes it more than that. I'll give you 130, and that's why I'm really pushing for us to get a solid answer, because what we have here, Region 12 opinion, is us being positive. It's actually quite meaningless. The Connecticut Department of Education's opinion is that it refers to total enrollment, which is less positive for us. So it would be great if we really got an answer, because then we could be at 139 definitely, or we could be at 135 even, or whatever we happen to be. We could all be all the way at 142 for all we know. And then we would be there. And anyone who had an argument with us, we could say, no, we have answered all the questions. And calculate. Bob can run numbers on 142, and we'll have something absolutely certain for next Tuesday. And that's what I'm going for, because once we have something certain, we'll have actual numbers, and people will say, look, we have now come to the point that we have a debt profile which actually won't change from what we're accustomed to, as Michelle was pointing out, and I think, and Valerie was pointing out. We have a debt profile that's not going to change, but we're going to have a revenue profile here too.
However,
This is the revenue that the least we can expect.
however, you're talking about actual numbers. There are no actual numbers. So, and indeed the $1 million, not an actual number. So, it's pending. It's not encumbered. And we have to live in this world that's straddling some well-founded optimism and the fact that nothing here is actual yet. It's a leap of faith, born on good experience. So, frankly, to ask school districts to sign off on a formula again, especially when everyone's kind of reeling from ECS cutbacks and the great unknown, they have already signed, they've already committed, but I think going back to them again is just the old can of worms. I think we have commitments. And if it's +1 or not, is not going to change this here, especially when you're going out 20 years, which is meaningless. So I think we have enough information now that if there's going to be a lot of people out there who still don't agree with our assumptions. We've seen it again and again. But and it is art, not science. But we're making a really, really valid attempt at science here. So to reopen, to rediscuss, to cause doubt at this stage just starts that little thread of unraveling. And I don't think we need to go there. These are not actual numbers. They are excellent guesses. And I'm all for just living with what we have now. And the state thinks it has agreed 139.
Rebecca.
So I jumped ahead to page 7, and Bob, is it,
I think Kim was going to make a presentation. on
well, I just have
page 7.
this is in regards to the question about the bond. Do we need to touch the bond in order to get to shovel-ready, if that's the decision that we make, to get to?
You would be borrowing band money at that point.
Okay. So,
You have to borrow money.
mhm,
We don't have enough money to be paying for the shovel-ready portion,
right.
so you would use band money to do it.
Okay. Well, the reason I was asking is because when we kept talking about this 1 million off the top, we need to start borrowing money before we even get the final approval from the state. So I think that it just kind of lends to what Valerie was saying. I don't think that we should go there with trying to take the million off the top. I think that that's just going to be an additional problem for us.
Right. And
Because we have to start borrowing before we even get the
right,
final
and
approval.
I did recognize the million in each one of the cost
Right.
pieces. I just needed to somehow focus on what that million
Yeah,
is.
no, I was concerned
Somewhere.
in terms of Alan's
Right.
question about trying to just take it off the top. I don't think we can.
It's premature.
Okay.
All right. Anyone else on that? Kim, were you going to address page 7?
Well, at the risk of using the word optimistic, this is a look at what will happen if all of these questions are answered, if we come to a consensus, and if we begin to move forward. Kessel Booz has created a schedule for us based on what happens if we begin to move forward. And the premise here is that the Board of Education will just make that decision to move forward on or before January 15th. So January is a big month for us here. At that point, revised schematic designs begin, and for those who haven't been involved in construction, the drawings get more and more particular as time goes on, more and more detail. Mr. Kava can tell you much more about that. We then get to the design development stage in May, and we begin with construction documents completed on or before September 15th, 2017. Those are the documents upon which bids are made, so they are very specific, how many light switches, the whole 9 yards. We begin a document review and approval period, and that would be completed on or before November 15th. We're still in 2017. In February of 2018, we have completed project bidding, which means we have even more solid numbers about what construction will cost, and construction would begin in April of 2018. It would be substantially complete on or about August 15th, 2019, with building occupancy available on or about that time. And then you see a date of December 1st, 2019. We're already into the program. The kids are already in the seats. However, these are the punch list items. You live with the building. You start to say, okay, we need to fix this, tweak this, so on and so forth. And the project is complete on December 1st, 2019. I look forward to that date.
Any questions for Kim?
Yes.
I'm sorry, Val.
So, January 15th is a Sunday. I'd like to know what's our schedule? What are we doing here? I mean, when do we take action? What dates are important? We have a forum schedule. I'm all about the calendar. We have a schedule.
Okay, Val. I think Dr. Costantino can answer the question.
Okay.
I had asked her to do that. Go ahead.
Okay, so to follow up now, we have a board meeting Monday night. It's a regular business board meeting. it's not really going to be ag STEM business, as far as I know, at this point. On Tuesday at 6 p.m. in the auditorium, we have a public conversation. At that point, we will do a short mini presentation of what we did tonight. And then it really will just be question and answers. Chairman will moderate. We will have our attorney, Gary Brashew, there. Castle Booze and O&G will be there. And we will answer questions. Really just answer questions for the public. And then on either Monday, January 23rd, or the latest February 6th, the board needs to take a vote to move forward to work with Castle Booze and O&G with the project. And I did speak today to Chuck Booze, and I spoke to him about possibly, can we have a marker at March 1st and then April or May 1st, et cetera. And that's very difficult for him. He really does not want to do that. He has to get his staff in place, just doesn't have people, waiting around to do the work. So he really needs, we're moving forward or we're not. And certainly, Mr. Chairman, you can call him to get further, or Greg, but,
Yeah, I talked to him.
Okay, so did you get that same message
No.
pretty much? Tonight?
No, I talked to him late this afternoon, and what I understand is that what I believe he was trying to communicate is that it's very difficult on a going forward basis to keep a team together if you don't have a run of work on that, but that he's absolutely, that does not make it impossible or unable to do it. So I think that if that was the impression you were given, I got a different impression.
Well, I wasn't alone when I heard that, and I can tell you that we certainly get clarification from him on Tuesday evening, but certainly he did.
The board needs to make a decision whether we're moving forward. I would suggest by January 23rd.
Okay, well
At the January 23rd meeting.
well, that is certainly in my timetable. So with that said, then after that, if the board decides to move forward, I think we just have to make sure that we are all ready, willing and able to go to CABE Day on the Hill. We have to be in touch with our legislators. We have to mobilize the community. We have to get out in the public and remind them about the project and share again the revised, Kim and I are happy to do that, the revised financials and building and all of that kind of stuff, and be cautiously optimistic that we will be moved through the legislature to the governor, to the bond commission, and opening on December 2019. But that's where we are at this point.
Well, can we set a date to vote on this? And is it possible to, it's a shame we don't have an action item tonight, frankly. Is it possible on the 10th? Yeah, after the public forum on the 10th? Is it possible for us to have a short meeting?
No,
I mean,
I would suggest that we listen to what the public has to say and not rush into a meeting that night. Let it digest. The superintendent has suggested the 23rd. Is that sufficient time?
Yes, I think so.
can we just put it on our calendars, the 23rd?
Fine.
So no ag STEM is going to be discussed on the 9th, but the 23rd will be an important night.
Yes.
Anthony.
So assuming we meet on the 23rd, what exactly are we contemplating when we say to move forward? And I'm not trying to be difficult, but literally, what is it that we're trying to do to say we're going to do what? Because we still have, there's some milestones in front of us, right? The education subcommittee has to get the project approved and sent to the Hill, and then they have to vote, right? So are we?
Well, I think
What
we're
are we doing?
authorizing the expenditure by Castle Booze and O&G to get us to where we need to be to make the full presentation to the legislature in the spring. Construction shovel ready.
But I think if Charlie's, without looking at Charlie's schedule, there's, I think, a good chunk of his fees are coming after the vote in Hartford. So we're voting to fund them through the vote, or, so then we have the opportunity, because again, if the vote goes down, or are we going to say, Charlie, you need $2 million to get you all the way through to this time next year?
No.
Well, that's why I'm asking specifically, because I think the public's going to want to know what exactly we're making a decision about.
Without having the schedule in front of me, my anticipation is getting us to the point where the legislature will make a decision. Obviously, if it were to go down again, hopefully not, but if that were to occur, I don't anticipate the board would, well, I don't know, the board would then decide whether to authorize further expenditures after that time.
Something along those lines.
Yeah. Michelle?
Along that same line, I think it would be helpful to have something from Castle Booze or to have Mr. Booze here on the 23rd, just so we know, because that is going to be sort of the final vote, whether we call it shovel-ready or continuing forward, to just take a look at like some of those stop points.
ONG too, right?
Right, ONG, right, because they're working on it as well. Whoever's working on it, just to not that they have to have a month-by-month detail of what they expect the expenditures to be, but, the vote in June, how far along in the process would he expect reasonably to be, and what sort of expenditure is that? Is that $1 million? Is that 1.5 million? Just so we know sort of what we're putting at risk for how long. And I think by January 23rd, that's plenty. That's several weeks. That's plenty of time to prepare some sort of guideline estimate. It doesn't have to be obviously to the penny, but I think that would be really helpful to make sure that that vote is informed.
All right, I agree with that. Anything else on this subject tonight? All right. Then that's it on that. Item 2. Then item 3 on the agenda, to consider and if appropriate, approve public comment guidelines as presented by the subcommittee for a trial period of 3 months. Does anybody want to speak to this from the committee? I will note that the board, there is a bylaws of the board currently a project in effect, I'm sorry. Bylaw 9325, meeting conduct. And then we have the Region 12 public comment guidelines that were presented to us by the committee. Does any member of the committee wish to speak to this? Or
I'm not a member of the committee.
Val?
does any member of the committee wish to speak to this? I don't think it records. Go ahead. Valerie?
Well, I was on the committee, and as you know, Jim, from time to time, the board has revisited our association with the public and what that means to have them here for public comment, perhaps the awkwardness of the one-sided conversation. And we did talk about how a forum would be important, which thankfully we're going to have on the 10th, so it could be a two-way street. But we have done this. This is nothing new. Things change. Originally, I know that on the agenda, the rules for public comment were printed on the agenda in the back, so all audience members could clearly understand what's going on. Of course, we have the new element of private individuals videotaping, and we now have that bar on the front of the agenda. So basically, we have a couple of new phenomena, and one of those is the sharing of 3 minutes, kind of like Congress, ceding back your time. So that's being addressed here. And time limits. And there's really nothing new. It was just revisited so we all get a better understanding.
All right. Jen, I'm sorry.
I think, too, that it was really just kind of finding structure again so that we had an efficient way of running a meeting, allowing people, I think there were a lot of different scenarios that we discussed, one of which was to allow there to be only a certain amount of people that speak, and however they signed up, they could have done that. There were a lot of different scenarios, and I think we all felt it was really important to allow everybody to speak, that felt the need to speak, but to really just allow there to be the 3-minute rule that we enforced, and allowing only one person, allowing you to speak only once a meeting. I think that that's a reasonable request. And I think it allows us to still hear what everybody has to say, but just in a more structured way so that we can move on to the other business, thank you, of the meeting. So I'm really happy with the way it turned out, I think. And I think that it's a great way to run our meetings, and I think it's really important to enforce the 3-minute rule.
All right, Greg?
Yeah, I took a look at our existing rule 9325, our existing policy on this. We already have the 3-minute rule. In fact, this has something that the proposed policy doesn't have, which is a maximum of 20 minutes per meeting allocated to any one item on the agenda. And when you look at that and combined with the 3-minute rule, I really think that what's out there, what we already have, and it gives the chairperson some discretion, it gives the board the discretion to extend the time for debate. I don't see why we're changing this rule. I really think the existing rule is fine, and I don't see the need to change it. And I'm personally going to vote against it because I just don't see the need for the change.
All right, anyone else? Valerie?
You don't have a motion yet. I'd like to make a motion that the board adopt the Region 12 public comment guidelines as presented in the meeting today.
All right, it's been moved and seconded.
Can I just say, we still have to address the sharing of minutes, and it's a guideline to be presented yet again. We're not changing our protocol necessarily. We're not changing our policy necessarily. We're just reinforcing it to the public.
Anthony?
I'm with Greg here on this. First of all, this seems like a policy wrapped in guideline disguise. When it says for a maximum of 3 minutes, may not, it's taking the discretion away from the chair to manage an orderly meeting. You have in the past, Jim, given people or afforded people more than 3 minutes when we like the subject. And when it's worthy. According to this, you don't have that authority anymore. We have, if somebody wanted to represent a contrarian view and organize their thoughts like somebody has in the past, I think there is sort of a limit that they can't sort of pile on and say, I have the right to step up to this mic for the next hour. But if somebody wanted to be a spokesman for a group and present a well-organized argument, personally, I'd rather hear that go on for 5 minutes or 10 minutes than hearing the other side of that, because it's all gamesmanship. So you say, don't do this, then fine. Then you get an organized mob that comes in and says, okay, we're going to script this for an hour. Everybody gets 3 minutes of speaking time, and the next person taps the shoulder, and they step in and pick up on the script where they left off. To me, that's far more disruptive. Far less, it's more aggravating personally to sit there and kind of listen to an argument be made like that as opposed to an organized thought. Now, I'm not condoning anybody in any manner that steps up in front of this board and throws personal insults and I think steps out of bounds. But in terms of being critical of board decisions or things, I think that's sort of what we all signed up for, is to be subject to public criticism. So I don't want to curtail that in any way, and I think it's very healthy for the board to hear as much about what everybody's thinking and not artificially suppress it. So I'm not in favor of this, but I am in favor of what I think we have is the chair exercising complete discretion and making a decision as to how to run an orderly meeting. And that includes cutting off somebody's microphone if they're going out of bounds or if they're being repetitive or off subject. I was at a Washington town meeting where our selectman was very firm with a particular individual when they were going off agenda and really literally cut the microphone off. So I think it's within our power to get what we want. We just have to do it. And so I can't vote for this.
Michael.
I agree with what Anthony is saying. And I have to say, as a member of the policy committee, I'm just kind of puzzled that it didn't come to the policy committee, which is what we normally would do when we're considering either amending policy or adding a new policy. That just kind of puzzles me that why it didn't come to the policy committee. And I think the policy committee could do what we do for any policy, which is look at what does CABE have to say about this subject. What other towns use it? What variety of different rules are out there? I would be very uncomfortable with making any changes without the normal vetting process that we normally use as a committee. I just don't quite understand why we're treating this as a special case and going outside the normal policy committee.
Michelle?
That I don't remember, but I feel like there was a meeting where we asked for some clarification and people volunteered. So I'm fine with that. The way I see this, and I like what was done here, it says public comment guidelines. This is not a policy change. For a policy change, it would have to go to committee. It would go before the board. These are guidelines that fall within the policy. So what I like about this is it's not making up any new rule. Just as we were said, there is no change. It's just clarifying so that there's no confusion. And I know if I were the chair, I would certainly appreciate this because I would want the people and the public to be informed before they go in so they know exactly how it works, what's expected, and so that there's no favoritism. I think 3 minutes is it's already in our policy, 3-minute time limit. It's right there, okay? So that's our policy, and it's been enforced sometimes and not enforced sometimes. And I like that the board chair has discretion to run an orderly meeting. That's also given in policy 1120 and how we conduct business. And I do think there should be some leeway. However, no matter what you do and no matter your best intentions, somebody's going to feel that they were slighted. And at this moment in time, when we have an audience full of people, sometimes, I think being fair and upfront in the beginning is important so that everyone has to be. And I like the concept of letting everyone who came to the meeting speak. I believe that's important. And I think the 3 minutes that wasn't arbitrary. That's already in our policy. So I appreciate what was done. I think it's important that we communicate to the public how it works up front so that they're not thinking that we are playing favorites. So I support this. I also just wanted to quickly say that as I've seen some of the emails that we've gotten about this coming up, I think members of the public sometimes forget that not only are we taxpayers, all of us up here as well, but we're also volunteers. And so after listening to sometimes an hour to an hour and a half of comment, we then stay for several hours and deliberate when a lot of the room leaves. So I think our time should be respected as much as volunteers and taxpayers as everyone else who comes to speak. So I like the guidelines and I appreciate the time.
All right, thank you.
Put into it.
Lisa? Stephanie, I'm sorry.
Just a point
I
of
keep doing that. I apologize for that.
Oh, no worries. So if this isn't an amendment to policy or it isn't policy in any way, how is this being presented to the public? Is it on, we're voting to post this on the agenda, or like how does the public receive the guideline?
Yes.
Yes, we were planning on putting it in the Reading and Review, also putting it on our webpage, and also attaching it to the back of the agendas or part of the agenda. And as you could see, it was a trial period of 3 months to just see how it goes. And then, if we like it, good. If we don't like it, if we want to make changes. But we did feel that we were just trying to put some guidelines in there because it's very frustrating for a lot of the board members when people are asking questions and we're not answering them. And there's this back and forth, and it gets kind of contentious when That's really not what public comment is about. And so we're just trying to put some guidelines in there to kind of help people understand what it's all about.
So this is just like a heads up pointer. So
Exactly.
when someone
That's
picks
all
up
it
the
really
sheet, they go,
was.
oh, yeah, let me just remember these couple of things. Okay.
Anyone else? Peter?
Just a short comment. I think it's basically up to you as chairman, when people present themselves before the board, to use your discretion. And if you want this to fall back on, that's fine. But I think you're astute enough, and most chairmen we've had are astute enough to, when people approach us, to decide whether they can be given more time than 3 minutes. I mean, I really think that setting 3 minutes, okay, it's fine, it's in our policy, but I think it's up to you as chairman to decide just at what point do you cut someone off.
All right. Alan?
Yeah, I don't remember the meeting that Michelle refers to where we suggested this happen, because I just think it's kind of control for control's sake. All we need to do is remind people, and we have to do this very often, that it's not a two-way dialogue. That's very important, and that happens very often. We have to remember ourselves not to answer questions, because sometimes when public comment is somebody standing in front of us saying, "Why are you doing this?" And you want to answer, but that's not the point. We don't answer why. But everything else is either already in the rules or is suddenly restrictive, such as you may not borrow time from another person. And I think that this is, at this juncture, we've had several meetings in the last year where we've had a lot of public comment. And it seems that clearly that's has its impact on us. But to come up with this at this juncture is kind of saying, we don't like what this is about. And obviously in times of tension and disagreement, we need to be more open and more free with public comment than more restrictive. And as people have said, that's up to the chairman to moderate in a moment-to-moment basis, to moderate the board, keep us from responding when we shouldn't. It's not a two-way dialogue. And also to keep the speakers to function in a timely manner and be respectful of the board. But also to weigh and digest the effect of the comment, and then as chairman, when necessary, turn to the board to, in a formal way or in a committee way or in some kind of action point, respond if necessary. So I think this in and of itself is really only annoying to the public, not really helpful to them or to us, and that's why I'm going to vote against it.
Rebecca?
I think that it's very important for us to listen to members of the public in order to perform our duty up here. But having said that, public comment in and of itself should not overwhelm the purpose of a board meeting, which can happen and has happened, where we've gotten to the point where we're crazy because we've been here, for 3 hours, past 2 hours of comment. That doesn't do the public any favors, and it doesn't do us any favors in terms of our ability to effectively function. And in terms of communication with the public comment is supposed to be specific to items on the agenda. And we've never stopped people from coming up. And I think that speaks to our dedication to wanting to hear what the public has to say. But the opportunity for public comment isn't meant to be for members of the public to make presentations of any great length to the board, because it's not an opportunity for dialogue. That's not the right place for it. Next week, we're having a meeting because we know that we need to have a dialogue with members of the public, so we're having an appropriate forum. This also reminds people that they should use email, and we do have people that use email, and we encourage that. So I think that it's not that, to me, this didn't feel restrictive in terms of public comment. This was a reminder that this is what the purpose of public comment is, and that there are multiple ways in order for members of the public to reach us as a board, and it helps us do our job better.
Jen?
Thank you, Rebecca, because that's a perfect way of explaining it. And I also appreciate what Michelle had to say. I just wanted to say a few things that, Anthony, I totally agree with you that I think that, it's important to let everybody come and speak. And then and I thought a lot about when people come in groups and allowing one person to speak. I also know there's a lot of times that people who maybe feel the same way don't come in as a group and they want to say something separate, but then they get lumped into a group. And I don't necessarily, I'm not saying lumped, but if we were to allow that to happen, it wouldn't allow that individual person that comes to speak to share if we had a group spokesperson for. Right. But I think it's important if we allow there to be the structure of having 3 minutes for every person, and it's not at the discretion of our chair, then it just allows it to just be even and fair across the board without it looking like favoritism, or which can happen. And I think that that's really what it's about. It's really about just allowing there to be some structure. And I always go back to that meeting last year, Alan, where 31 parents from Burnham came, and it was impactful for me. It changed how I thought and how I voted that night. And I thought it was really important for me to hear every single voice that came to the podium. And I wouldn't have had it or wanted it to be any other way. I just think that asking there to be a time limit is reasonable. I still want to hear from every single person. I just think it's important that there's some structure to it so that we can have an effective meeting and still feel like people are being heard, but allowing there to be structure in the process. That's it.
Greg?
Yeah, in kind of a perverse sort of way, the comment guidelines we're looking at tonight actually make it harder to run the meeting, and I think this microphone is dying. Harder to run the meeting, and more likely that we're going to get stuck here all night, because the current guidelines have 3 minutes, just like this. The current guidelines have a maximum of 20 minutes to any one agenda item. This doesn't. So already, if you had a decision you needed to have made that night, and you knew you had people that had to leave the meeting at 11 or 12, you could end up with a room full of people running the meeting into the wee hours of the morning, as what's happened in front of a lot of land use commissions that I've practiced in front of. And the net effect of that is you've lost control of the process with these guidelines that are being proposed. Now, the existing guidelines, if we have a bunch of people coming to comment on something we really want to hear, and we need to hear it that night, and we don't have a deadline that's killing us, under the existing guidelines, we can relax the 20-minute rule and allow people to go on. So the existing guidelines have more ability to control the meeting, and they have more flexibility than these proposed guidelines allow. The other thing about borrowing time from another person, okay, if you really feel that that's a hill you want to die on, and I think somebody came here and did it once in the 8 years I've been on the board, then, and I don't care if they spoke for 20 minutes or whatever, but the point is, if they spoke for 20 minutes, that's the end of it. Your topic is over, and you can stop it at that point for the night, and everybody else that came doesn't get to speak. Now, I wouldn't want to be the person that spoke for 20 minutes, ate the time, and had all my other friends go home that didn't have a chance to speak. But what I'm saying is that the existing guidelines give more flexibility, greater control, allow us to avoid an important decision having to be postponed because we had to listen to comment all night instead of a meeting. And frankly, I just think this should have gone to policy, and I think it should be referred back to policy. And I'm going to move that it be referred back to policy for further consideration, because it's not even phrased as a policy. It's not a policy. It should be a policy if it's going to be a policy. And that's what I think we should do. So I'm going to move that it be sent back to the policy committee for review.
Second.
All right, there's been a new motion, moved and seconded.
What's the motion? He wants to amend.
Michelle?
You,
I'm not certain.
We need to go home.
Yeah, I mean,
I just wanted to point out that this is a guideline and not a policy, and therefore the policy supersedes it, so that 20-minute limit is still there if Jim ever feels he wants to exercise it. We haven't, but if for some reason he felt that we were being derailed, he certainly has the authority to do that because it's in the policy. This is just a guideline for the public, interpreting the policy just to remind them of how it works. Nothing in here is new except for this borrowed piece, the borrowed time. Everything else is in the policy. This is just a a little takeout from the policy to remind people. And this borrowed part, I don't see it anywhere. It doesn't go against the policy.
Anthony? Do we have a second? Well, actually, we should be speaking to the motion. The motion on the table is to refer this back to.
Correct.
Which, that motion?
We haven't voted on my motion yet.
Motions on the table?
Yeah, we haven't voted on the first one.
Greg, would you? I'm not going to recognize your motion, Greg. Go ahead. All right, so we're back to the first motion, which is to approve this as a guideline.
So as a guideline, as opposed to rules, which if we have a policy, so when it says you may not borrow time, so that means that that's off the table, never to be discussed again, even if we think it has wonderful merit. But you're saying that policy says that we don't have to do that, because then the chairman would seem arbitrary and perhaps capricious when somebody says, but I want to do this. Say, that's a great idea. I want to hear how you went to fill in the blank to help poor children do something, and we think that's worthy of 20 minutes. You don't have that discretion anymore. So if we're going to write a guideline, then let's write a guideline that says something like, we discourage the borrowing of time. And ultimately, every person has 3 minutes. But that time can change at the discretion of the chair, and remind people, if it's a guideline, what the rules are or what the policies are that we've already established. It seems like we're trying to do that, but we can't help ourselves by go 2 or 3 steps beyond, which I think in the end is going to be a bigger issue.
Valerie?
Sometimes a cigar is just a cigar.
Well, then,
I mean,
then
it's
let's
a
have-
it's
then
a
let's have vote then.
guideline. In my time on the board, once again, since I feel like a real senior citizen here, we had guidelines that we presented to the public, because not every person who shows up has been here multiple times and gets what's going on. It's just information. It's just, where are the exits? How do you comport yourself? And also, and Michelle made a really important point, it's protecting our time as well as their time, and just trying to be as fair can be. Now, borrowing someone else's time, I think that's not quite fair. We want everyone to speak, but speak in a brief way, which is, of course, very hard for us to do up here. But just get the job done, get it done politely, get it done in a democratic fashion. These are guidelines. It's not policy. Yes, let's revisit the policy if we want to make it either more draconian or not. But this is just a reminder of how we should be sitting around. And I think I'll talk even longer, Alan, since you're making fun right now, because the other part of this is how to save time.
No.
The part of this was, how the heck can we get home before midnight? And we want to hear people. We encourage it. I truly encourage that. But sometimes there's some long-winded people on the board and some long-winded people in the audience. And discretion of the chair can put the chair in a difficult position. So everyone knows the rules going in. It's a guideline. It's a cigar.
Peter?
I move the question.
Oh, please.
All right, let's vote on that one.
All right, there's a motion to move the question. All those in favor, which, for those who don't know, means we have to stop debating and vote on the motion.
Sounds good to me.
All those in favor of moving the question, raise your hand.
I think.
Any opposed? Raise your hand. Any abstain? Raise your hand. All right, the motion passes. The question is moved. So the motion on the table is to approve Region 12 public comment guidelines as guidelines of the board. It does say, I think in the agenda, for a trial period of 3 months. All those in favor, I'm sorry?
That contradict policy.
All those in favor of the guidelines, raise your hand.
Kava, you just moved the question. Come on.
Got it? All those opposed, raise your hand. Got it? Any abstain?
Typical.
All right, the policy guidelines pass. They are for a trial period of 3 months.
Move to
I just
adjourn.
want to mention, I should have responded before to one thing Anthony said, that I sometimes let people speak who are, that I'm in favor of. That's not fair. I've let plenty of people speak at length who have all different opinions, so it's not,
I didn't, I did not mean it in that,
all
in
right,
that
fine.
way.
Is there anything else?
Move to adjourn.
Move to adjourn. All those in favor say aye. Thank you.